Gideon Mercer didn't knock. He never knocked. He walked straight through Martha Calloway's front door like he already owned it, because, in his mind, he already did. He dropped a stack of papers on her kitchen table so hard the cups rattled, and he looked at her the way a man looks at something he's about to throw away. "You got till Friday," he said. "Not a day more." Martha didn't move. She stood holding an empty bucket, the last bucket, and her hands were shaking, though not from the cold. Behind her, she could hear Rosie coughing in the back room. Luke hadn't eaten since morning. She had nothing left. No money, no husband, no one coming. And this man who had circled her land for months like a hawk over something already dead, was smiling. If that had been your home, your children, what would you have done? Stay with me, because what happened next on that frozen prairie changed not just one family, it changed every soul in the valley. And it all started with a stranger, an axe, and a promise so unexpected it almost didn't seem real. Before we go further, if stories like this move you, if you believe there are still people in this world worth believing in, subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that like button and drop your city or country in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. I read every single one. Now, let's go back to that Friday. Let's go back to the moment everything changed. The bucket was tin, dented on one side from the time it had been kicked by the old draft horse 2 summers ago, and it held maybe 1.5 quarts of milk, warm, a little frothy, and nowhere near enough. Martha Calloway stood in the middle of her barn and stared at it. She had learned, in the years since her husband Thomas had died, that there was a particular kind of silence that came right before a person broke. It wasn't loud. It didn't announce itself. It just settled in, slow and heavy, like the first real snow of a hard winter, and it sat on your chest until breathing felt like work. This was that silence. She picked up the bucket carefully, the way you carry something you know is the last of something, and she walked back toward the house. The cold hit her face the moment she stepped out of the barn. Not the pleasant kind of cold that smells like pine needles and clean air, but the mean kind. The kind that burns the inside of your nose and makes your eyes water before you've even had a reason to cry. She had plenty of reasons to cry. She just didn't do it outside where the children could see. Luke was 11 years old, and he tried very hard to pretend he wasn't hungry. He'd gotten good at it over the past 3 weeks, pushing food around his plate if there was food, or sitting very straight and very still at the table as if his posture could somehow make up for the empty bowl. He had his father's eyes. That was the thing that caught Martha off guard sometimes, in the quiet moments. The way Luke would look at her across the room and she'd see Thomas looking back, serious and steady and trying to hold something together that was coming apart. Rosie was 7 and did not yet know how to pretend. She asked for things. She still believed in the uncomplicated way that 7-year-olds believe, that asking was enough. She'd asked for warm bread 3 mornings in a row, and Martha had said soon all 3 times. And the word had started to feel like a lie. She was too tired to stop telling. Martha set the bucket on the kitchen table and looked at it for a long moment. 1.5 quarts of milk. 2 children. One mother who hadn't eaten a proper meal in 4 days. She divided the milk into 2 cups, filled them as evenly as she could, and set them out for Luke and Rosie. Then she turned to the stove and busied herself with the pretense of cooking, moving pots, adjusting a fire that had almost nothing to cook over, so they wouldn't see her face while they drank. This was the life she had built. This was what remained of it. It hadn't always been this way, and that was maybe the cruelest part. The Calloway Ranch had once been the kind of place that people in the valley pointed to when they talked about what a person could build if they worked hard enough and wanted it badly enough. Thomas Calloway had homesteaded the land 15 years ago with $40, a mule, and a stubbornness that his neighbors alternately admired and found exhausting. He'd built the house himself, plank by plank. He'd dug the well. He'd strung every foot of fence on the eastern pasture with his own 2 hands, often by lantern light after a full day of everything else. Martha had been beside him for all of it. She'd driven nails when he needed a second pair of hands. She'd helped birth calves in the middle of February nights when the temperature dropped so low that the lantern oil thickened. She'd kept the accounts, patched the roof, planted the kitchen garden, canned enough vegetables each summer to last through the worst of winter, and still found time to read to Luke and Rosie every night before bed because she believed, fiercely and without apology, that children who heard stories grew up to understand the world better than children who didn't. and then Thomas got sick. It happened the way catastrophic things often happen. Not all at once, not dramatically, but gradually and then suddenly. A cough that didn't go away. Weight that kept dropping no matter how much he ate. A gray look around his eyes that Martha noticed long before the doctor had a name for what it was. By the time they understood what was happening, there wasn't enough time left to do much about it. Thomas died on a Wednesday in early March, 2 years ago. The ground was still frozen. She couldn't bury him until April. She'd kept the ranch going through sheer force of will and not much else. She'd sold 2 of the 4 milk cows to cover the funeral expenses, and the first of several debts she hadn't fully known about until she sat down with Thomas's papers after he was gone. She'd discovered, in the way widows often discover things, that her husband had been quietly carrying burdens he hadn't shared, borrowing against the property in the final year of his illness to keep things running without worrying her. She didn't blame him for it. She understood why he'd done it. But understanding something doesn't make it easier to deal with. The debts were real. The deadlines were real. And Gideon Mercer had known about them before she did. Gideon Mercer was the kind of man who knew things before he was supposed to know them. He owned 300 acres on the valley's western side, plus the grain supply operation, and a partial stake in the county's only bank, which meant he had a financial interest in nearly every transaction that happened within 40 miles. And he had a habit of positioning himself to benefit from other people's misfortune with a timing that was too consistent to be accidental. He'd been watching the Callaway Ranch for a long time, long enough that people in town had started to whisper about it, the way they whispered about things that made them uncomfortable, quietly, between themselves, without quite being willing to say it out loud to his face. He'd come to Martha 3 times in the past year with what he called offers. The first time she'd listened politely and said no. The second time she'd been less polite. The third time, the time he'd shown up with a representative from the bank and a stack of papers that laid out exactly how much she owed and exactly when each payment was due. She'd stood in her own doorway and told him to get off her property. He'd smiled then. That particular smile of his, the one that meant he wasn't worried because he didn't need to be. "You've got till winter, Mrs. Callaway," he'd said. "Think it over." That had been in September. It was now the second week of November, and winter had arrived ahead of schedule, with a ferocity that felt almost personal. The fences were down in 2 places she hadn't been able to fix. The windmill had a broken gear that made it groan and shudder and produce about 1/3 of the water it should. The barn roof had a soft spot that she'd been watching with dread through every rainstorm since August. One of her remaining milk cows had gone dry too early in the season, and she was staring at a bucket of milk and doing arithmetic that had no good answer. Friday was 3 days away. She was standing at the kitchen window, watching the sky go the particular shade of bruised purple that meant serious cold was coming, when she saw him. He appeared at the top of the rise on the far end of her property, just a shape at first, dark against the failing light, moving slow and deliberate the way people move when they've been walking a long time and know there's still a ways to go. As he got closer, she could make out the 2 mules behind him, loaded down with what looked like a heavy pack, and the shape of an axe strapped across his back. Her first thought was traveler. Her second thought was trouble. Her third thought, which she was ashamed of even as she had it, was I have nothing to give him. She watched him stop at the edge of her yard and look at the house. He didn't call out, didn't wave, just stood there and looked the way a man looks when he's trying to take an honest measure of a situation before he steps into it. Then he took off his hat. It was such a simple gesture that it almost didn't register. But there was something in the way he did it, deliberately, without being asked, standing in her yard in the cold with the wind picking up, that made her open the door. He was older than she'd expected. Maybe 50, maybe a bit past it, with a face that had lived entirely outdoors for a very long time. His coat was good, heavy canvas, well-oiled, but everything else about him was worn to the point of being worn through. There were holes in his boots that he'd tried to stuff with something, and his hands, when he held his hat, were cracked and scarred in the specific way of a man who worked with them every day without much protection. He didn't introduce himself right away. He looked at the barn, at the broken fence line visible along the pasture edge, at the windmill still grinding and stuttering against the wind. He looked at all of it the way someone looks when they're doing calculations. Then he looked at her. "I can fix it," he said. "All of it, before the hard freeze sets in." She blinked. "You can fix what?" "The fence, the windmill. That barn roof. Don't try to tell me the barn roof's fine. He glanced at it, then back at her. The east pasture gate's hanging wrong too. Seen it on the way up. Martha stared at him. Who are you? Elias Boone. He said it plainly, like a man who doesn't feel the need to dress up his name. I've been trapping up in the high country, coming down for the winter. He paused. I heard in town you might be in a hard spot. The words hit differently than he probably intended. She felt heat rise in her face. That particular heat of humiliation, of knowing that your circumstances had become a thing that strangers discussed. What do you want? She asked. Her voice came out harder than she meant it to. He didn't flinch. Not money, he said. I can see there isn't any. Then what? He was quiet for a moment, and in that moment she noticed that he was holding his hat so tightly the brim was bending. I've got 2 children, he said, a boy and a girl. My sister's been keeping them, up north, other side of the mountains. I've been working to save enough to bring them home. He stopped, started again. I need a place to winter over and get some work done before I go for them. I'll fix everything on this property that's broken. I'll stack enough wood to see you through March. I'll do whatever needs doing. He met her eyes. And when I bring my children home, however long that takes, I'm asking that you'll feed them, just until we're on our feet. Martha didn't say anything. The wind moved between them, cold and indifferent. Feed my children, he said quietly, and I'll save your ranch. She should have said no. Any reasonable woman alone with 2 hungry children on a failing homestead in the middle of a hard November would have said no. She didn't know this man from a stone in the road. She had no way of verifying a single word he'd said. He could be lying about the children. He could be lying about the work. He could be one of Gideon Mercer's people, for all she knew, though something in her gut said that wasn't right, said that Gideon Mercer's people didn't look like they'd spent a winter alone in the mountains and come out without bitterness. She looked at his hands again, the cracks across the knuckles, the callus-thickened palms. Those were not the hands of a man who didn't work. You can sleep in the barn, she said at last. 1 week. If the fence isn't fixed in 1 week, you move on. Something shifted in his face. Not quite relief, not quite gratitude. More like a man who'd asked for something he wasn't sure he deserved and was relieved to find he might. 1 week, he said. I'll have the fence and the windmill done in 3 days. She almost told him not to make promises he couldn't keep. She stopped herself because she had a feeling, unreasonable, stubborn, possibly foolish, that this particular man might be someone who meant what he said. Oh, he had the fence done in 2 days. Martha didn't go out and watch. That felt like hovering, and she didn't want to hover. But she could see from the kitchen window, and what she saw made her stop whatever she was doing and look. He worked from before dawn until the light was completely gone, moving with the economical efficiency of someone who had long ago given up doing anything the slow way. He didn't ask for help. He didn't make noise about what he was doing. He just did it. The windmill was done the day after that. She brought him coffee on that morning, second morning, just after sunup, because it seemed wrong not to, and because it was very cold, and even if she didn't fully trust him yet, she wasn't the kind of person who let someone work in the cold without something warm to drink. He was already at the base of the windmill when she came out, his tools laid out around him in a pattern that looked almost careful. He took the coffee with both hands and drank half of it before he said anything. You've got good land here, he said. This place was built right. My husband built it. He nodded. Said nothing about the husband, which she appreciated. Too many people, when they learned she was widowed, felt compelled to say something about it. Something about Thomas, or about her strength, or about how he would have wanted this or wanted that. As if they'd known him. As if their words were useful. Elias Boone just nodded and looked at the windmill. The gears cracked. I can replace it with what I've got in the pack. Carried this kind of hardware for the equipment up in the camps. He turned back to the windmill and got back to work. You'll have full water by this afternoon. She did. By the end of the first week, Luke had started following him. Martha noticed it on a Tuesday, Luke appearing from around the corner of the barn, watching Elias work on the roof from a safe distance, the way boys watch things they're interested in but haven't yet admitted they're interested in. She started to call Luke inside, then stopped herself. Something about the way Elias registered the boy's presence, a slight shift, nothing dramatic, the barest acknowledgement, made her think it might be all right. Elias didn't try too hard with Luke. He didn't perform friendliness. He just, occasionally, said things like, "Hand me that, would you?" And, "You see what I'm doing here? This is how you find where the rot is before it gets into the structure." And Luke, cautious and serious and achingly like his father, would look where he was pointing and occasionally say, "Okay," or ask one careful question. Rosie had no such caution. By the fourth day, Rosie had decided that Elias Boone was the most interesting person she had encountered in recent memory, and she had appointed herself his primary source of conversation. She followed him to the barn and back. She asked him questions about the mountains. She told him, at considerable length, about a game she'd invented that involved the fence posts and a piece of rope and rules that changed depending on her mood. He listened to all of it with a patience that Martha watched with something she couldn't quite name. He never talked down to Rosie. He never talked over her either. He talked to her like someone who genuinely thought what she was saying was worth paying attention to. She noticed things like that. She couldn't help noticing. One evening, the 11th night by her count, she found him sitting on the porch steps after the children had gone to bed. He had a small piece of wood in his hands and a knife, and he was carving something slowly, almost absently, in the dark. She hesitated at the door, then came and stood near him, not quite next to him. "You don't have to sit out in the cold," she said. "I don't mind the cold." He turned the wood over. "You mind if I stay out here a while?" "It's your porch as much as anyone's," she said, and then felt immediately strange about having said it, because it wasn't his porch, except in the way that a person who has fixed everything on your property and not asked for money has a certain claim on the word. He didn't push on it. He kept carving. After a minute, she sat down on the step above him, pulling her shawl tighter. "What are you making?" she asked. "Horse." He held it up. It was rough, barely a shape, really. "For my daughter. She likes horses." "How old is she?" 9. "My boy's 12. She thought about that. 2 years since she'd seen them, he'd told Luke. He'd said it matter-of-factly, the way you talk about hard facts that have stopped surprising you. "Do they know you're coming?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "My sister writes to them for me." She understood then several things at once, things that rearranged themselves quietly into a picture that made her chest ache in a way she hadn't expected. "Elias," she said. He looked up at her. In the dark, with the cold pressing in around them, he looked very tired and very steady all at once. "Friday is 3 days away," she said. "Gideon Mercer is coming with papers." He already knew about Friday. She'd seen it in the way he'd pushed through the barn roof work without stopping, driven by something more than just the desire to be useful. "I know," he said. "I don't know what I'm going to do," she admitted. It was the first time she'd said it out loud to anyone, and the plainness of it surprised her. How easy it was to say, and how much lighter she felt having said it. He looked back at the rough little horse in his hands. "One thing at a time," he said quietly. "That's all you can do." It wasn't an answer. It wasn't a plan. But the way he said it, not like comfort, not like false hope, but like a simple statement of strategy from someone who had needed it many times himself, it steadied her in a way she hadn't been steadied in a very long time. She sat on that step for another half hour before going inside. She didn't sleep well that night, but she slept. The morning, Gideon Mercer's wagon appeared at the top of the rise. The sky was the flat white of an impending blizzard, and the temperature had dropped 8 degrees since dawn. Martha was at the stove when she heard the wheels on the frozen ground, and she knew before she even looked out what she was going to see. She looked anyway. 3 men on horseback flanking a wagon. In the wagon, 2 figures, Mercer in his good coat, and beside him a man she recognized as the county banker, holding a leather case on his lap. Official. Deliberate. The whole procession arranged to communicate, before a single word was spoken, that this was settled business. Her hands tightened on the edge of the stove. Behind her, she heard Elias come in from the barn. He stopped when he saw her face, then looked past her at the window, and then something happened in his expression that she would remember for a very long time. Not anger, exactly, and not resignation either. Something quieter and harder than either of those things. The look of a man who has made a decision he hasn't told you about yet. "Get the children inside," he said. "They're already inside." He nodded once. "Then let's go see what they want," he said, as though there was any mystery about what they wanted, as though the answer to that question was something other than everything. He opened the front door and walked out first, and she followed him into the cold white morning, and somewhere behind them, she could hear Rosie ask Luke what was happening. Luke, because he was 11 and his father's son and had been paying careful attention for weeks, said nothing at all. Gideon Mercer didn't get down from the wagon right away. That was a thing Martha had noticed about him over the past year. He had a talent for making people wait. He'd sit or stand just long enough that you started to feel the waiting, started to feel the weight of your own anticipation pressing down on you, and by the time he actually moved, you were already slightly off balance. It was a small power, a petty one, but he used it with the consistency of someone who had discovered early that it worked. He climbed down slowly, adjusted his coat, said something to the banker that Martha couldn't hear, and then turned and walked toward them with the unhurried confidence of a man who believed the outcome of this conversation had already been decided. His eyes went to Elias first. Just a flicker, a quick, measuring look, and then back to Martha. "Mrs. Calloway." He nodded barely. "Didn't expect company." "Mr. Boone is working the ranch," Martha said. She kept her voice even. She had practiced keeping her voice even around this man for over a year now, and she was getting better at it, though it cost her something every time. Mercer looked at Elias again, longer this time, taking inventory. The worn coat, the axe still leaning against the porch rail where Elias had set it down when he came in for coffee. The way Elias stood. Not aggressive, not deferential, just present in the particular way of someone who has spent a long time in places where how you held yourself determined what happened next. "Working the ranch," Mercer repeated, like the phrase amused him. "Well, that's something." He pulled the papers from inside his coat, not the banker's papers, his own, and held them out toward Martha. "Doesn't change what today is, though." Martha didn't take the papers. She kept her hands at her sides. "I know what today is," she said. "Then you know the banknotes due. $1,140 plus the interest accumulated since August." He said it cleanly, without cruelty, which was somehow worse than if he'd said it with cruelty. Like it was simply mathematics. Like she was simply a column in a ledger that wasn't adding up. "I've spoken with Harold." He gestured toward the banker, who had climbed down from the wagon and was now standing a few feet back, holding his leather case against his chest like a shield. "And the bank's position hasn't changed. The property secures the debt. If the debt isn't satisfied today, foreclosure proceedings begin Monday." The banker, Harold Finch, had the particular look of a man who was deeply uncomfortable with where he was and what he was doing, but had decided at some point in his career that discomfort was a price he was willing to pay for security. He was in his mid-50s, soft around the middle, with a careful mustache and eyes that couldn't quite settle on any one person. "Mrs. Calloway," Harold said, "I want you to know that the bank—" "Harold!" Mercer didn't look at him, just said the name, and Harold stopped. Martha felt Elias shift slightly beside her. Not toward Mercer, not a threatening movement, just a small adjustment, the way a person adjusts when they've heard something that requires a recalibration of what they're prepared to do. "How much of that 1,100 is interest you added after August?" Elias asked. Mercer turned to him slowly. "I don't believe I was speaking to you." "No," Elias said, "but I'm asking." The two men looked at each other. Mercer was taller, better dressed, better fed, and operating on home territory in the sense that he had spent his whole life in this valley, and Elias Boone had arrived 11 days ago with 2 mules and a cracked pair of boots. None of that seemed to register on Elias's face as a disadvantage. 260 of it, Harold said quietly, not looking at Mercer. Mercer turned to Harold then, and whatever Harold saw in that look made him take a small step back. "The original note was $880, Elias said. "That right, Mrs. Calloway?" Martha looked at him. She hadn't told him the specific number. "How did you left the papers on the table 2 nights ago when you went to check on Rosie. I wasn't looking for them. I just saw." She should have felt invaded by that, maybe. She found she didn't. "That's right," she said. $880. Elias nodded slowly, and she could see him doing something behind his eyes. Not calculating exactly, but something adjacent to it. Something that looked like a man arriving at a decision through a door he'd been standing in front of for a while. "You give us until Monday," Elias said to Mercer. "That's 2 more days. You were already going to wait until Monday to file. Give her 2 days." "That's not how the agreement says today." Elias's voice was perfectly level. I'm asking you to extend it 2 days, not as a legal matter, as a matter of one person asking another person for something reasonable. Mercer studied him. And why would I do that? Because it costs you nothing, Elias said. And because whatever you think this property is worth to you right now, it's worth more if you haven't taken it by force. People remember how a man takes things. Something moved across Mercer's face, a tightening around the eyes, quick and controlled. He didn't like that. He particularly didn't like that it was true, and that they both knew it was true, and that Elias had said it in front of Harold Finch, who would repeat it to someone, because Harold Finch always repeated things to someone. Monday, Mercer said at last, and the word came out like something he was swallowing wrong. You have until Monday morning. He tucked the papers back into his coat. Don't make me come back twice, Mrs. Calloway. He turned and walked back to the wagon. Harold Finch followed him without making eye contact with either of them. Martha stood very still until the wagon had turned and started back up the rise toward the road. Then she let out a breath that she hadn't fully realized she'd been holding, and it came out shaky at the edges in a way that embarrassed her. Thank you, she said, to the space beside her, not quite looking at Elias. Don't thank me yet, he said. We've got 2 days. 2 days to do what? I don't have $1,100. I don't have $100. I have $43 in the box under the kitchen floorboard and 2 milk cows and whatever's left in the smokehouse. Elias was quiet for a moment. He looked at the spot where the wagon had been, then back at the barn. Come with me, he said. She followed him into the barn, and he went straight to the back stall, the one she'd told him to use for storage, the one where he'd put his pack and his gear and the various things he'd come down from the mountains carrying. He crouched down and started unbuckling the straps on the largest pack, the one she'd assumed held trapping supplies and personal effects. He opened the flap and started lifting things out carefully, one at a time, and setting them on the straw-covered floor beside him. They were pelts, not the ordinary kind, not rabbit or beaver, the everyday currency of frontier trapping. These were something else. A silver fox pelt so clean and thick it seemed to absorb the gray barn light and give it back differently. 2 wolf furs, large and dark, with a quality of density that Martha had never seen in a pelt before. Several ermine, small, yes, but the winter white was perfect, unblemished, the kind of ermine that ended up on garments in cities far east of here. And at the bottom, wrapped in oilcloth and laid flat, what appeared to be a mountain lion skin of unusual size and remarkable condition. Martha stared. Elias, she said slowly. 4 years, he said. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the pelts. 4 winters in the high country. Took the best I could find. Was going to sell them in the spring, take the money, go get my children. He paused. The silver fox alone. A merchant in Denver offered me $300 for it 18 months ago. I didn't sell because I thought I could get more when I had the full collection together. She understood what he was showing her. She also understood what it would mean if he sold it. Her throat felt very tight. These would cover the debt, she said, and then some. Elias, you can't. I haven't said I'm going to. He finally looked at her. I said we have 2 days. I'm showing you what exists, what we do with it. That's a different conversation. He started packing the pelts back carefully, the way you handle things that have cost you years. But I needed you to know it exists, because the worst thing right now would be for you to give up on something that still has a solution. She watched him wrap the oilcloth back around the mountain lion skin, slow and deliberate. Why? She asked. Why would you even consider it? You don't know us. You didn't know us 2 weeks ago. He tucked the flap down and buckled the strap before he answered. My children have been with my sister for 2 years, he said. Ruth, my daughter, she was 7 when I left. My boy Cal was 10. I told them I'd be back by the first winter. And then the first winter came and I wasn't ready. And then the second winter. He stopped, pressed his hand flat against the top of the pack. I know what it is to have people depending on you and feel like you're coming up short every time you try. I know what that does to a person. He stood up. I'm not saying I'll sell them. I'm saying we think about it. And what do you get of it? She asked, because she had spent 2 years learning that nothing came without a price, and she needed to understand what the price was before she could accept anything. He looked at her steadily. You said you'd feed my children when I brought them home. That's worth $1,100 to you? Having somewhere to bring them home to, he said quietly, is worth quite a bit. She didn't say anything. The barn was very cold and very still, and somewhere above them the repaired roof held firm against a wind that had started picking up from the north. She walked back to the house, and she sat at the kitchen table, and she put her hands flat on the wood and looked at them for a long time. She still hadn't decided anything when Luke appeared in the doorway, watching her with those eyes that weren't his anymore. Not really, not since Thomas, those eyes that had belonged to someone else first. "Mom," he said, "is the man going to leave?" "I don't know yet, baby." Luke was quiet for a second. Then, "He showed me how to test a fence post for rot without pulling it out. You push on it at the base, and if it moves a certain way, you know." He paused. "Dad never showed me that." She looked at her son for a moment. "Go get your sister for supper," she said gently. He went. She stayed at the table another minute, and the decision that had been forming in her chest, shapeless and uncomfortable and not yet named, got a little heavier, a little more solid. She still didn't do anything about it that night. Set. The next morning, Saturday, she woke up before dawn to the sound of the axe. She lay in bed for a moment, listening to the rhythm of it. Measured, consistent. The sound of someone who had been swinging an axe long enough that they didn't think about it anymore. It was just a thing their body did. Then she got up and dressed and went to the window. He was splitting wood in the dark. He had a lantern set on a stump beside him, throwing a small circle of orange light, and he worked in and out of that light as he moved logs to the block and split them and stacked them. The pile was already considerable, bigger than it had been when she went to bed. She made coffee and brought him a cup at what she judged to be a reasonable stopping point in his rhythm. He took it without breaking the conversation she hadn't started. "Figured I'd get as much done as I can," he said. "Whatever happens Monday." "You're still planning to leave?" "I'm planning to do what's right," he said carefully. "What that turns out to be. I haven't got it settled yet either." She wrapped her hands around her own cup. The cold was ferocious this morning, the kind that got into your lungs if you breathed too fast. "Tell me about them," she said. "Cal and Ruth." He looked at her sideways like the request surprised him. "Cal talks too much," he said. "Always has. His mother, my wife, she passed when Ruth was a baby. She used to say he came out talking and never stopped. He's got a head for numbers. Remembers things. Embarrassing things mostly. Things you said 3 years ago that you'd rather forget." He almost smiled. It was a crooked, involuntary thing, quick as a fish breaking the water surface. "Ruth is quieter. She watches. She's got her mother's way of looking at you like she's reading something on your face you didn't mean to write." "She sounds like Luke," Martha said. And then, because it came out before she could weigh it, "He misses his father the way you can't talk about. He just carries it." Elias nodded slowly. He understood that kind of missing. She could see that he did. "How long's it been?" he asked. 2 years in April." He didn't say he was sorry. She appreciated that. The sorries had stopped meaning anything around the 8-month mark. They stood there in the cold and the dark, two people who had each lost something large enough to change the shape of everything that came after, and neither of them said anything more for a while, and somehow that was all right. It was Luke who changed things. Not intentionally. Luke would have been horrified if he'd understood the effect of what he did, because he was the kind of boy who thought carefully before doing things and would not have wanted to be responsible for forcing someone's hand. But Saturday afternoon, while Martha was inside trying to stretch the last of the dried beans into something that qualified as a meal, Luke found Elias in the barn fixing the broken hinge on the large door, the one that had been dragging and catching since October. And he sat on a hay bale and watched for a while, the way he'd started doing, and then he said, out of absolutely nowhere, "Are you going to be here for Christmas?" Elias kept working. "Don't know yet." "It's just," Luke said, and then stopped. Started again. "It's just that last Christmas was bad. Mom tried to make it not bad. She made paper decorations and everything, but we all knew." He picked at a piece of straw. "Rosie doesn't remember as much as I do about how it used to be. I think that's better for her. I remember all of it." Elias set down the hinge and looked at him. "What do you remember?" he asked. Luke thought about it seriously, the way he thought about everything seriously. "My dad used to read to us on Christmas Eve," he said. "Just stories. Not anything special. Just whatever we wanted to hear. And he did the voices. He was bad at it, but he did them anyway. He paused. Mom reads to us now. She's better at the voices. But it's different. Elias looked at his hands for a moment. Yeah, he said. Different is different. Even when the new thing is fine, it's still different. Luke looked up at him. Do you read to your kids? I used to, before. He picked the hinge back up. Ruth wanted the same story every single night for about a year when she was 5. Something about a horse who learned to fly. I read it so many times I had it memorized. He worked the screw, careful and patient. I still know it, word for word. That's kind of sad, Luke said, with the blunt honesty of an 11-year-old. Yeah, Elias said. Kind of is. Luke sat with that for a minute. Then, if you did stay, for Christmas, would your kids come here? That's a big if, son. I know, but if. Elias put the hinge in place and tested the door. It swung smooth and quiet, clean as anything, no drag, no catch. He looked at it for a second with the brief, expressionless satisfaction of a person who has fixed something correctly. If they came, he said, Ruth would probably follow Rosie around everywhere, and Cal would probably try to know more about ranching than me within the first week. Luke almost smiled. It was a rare thing, and it happened fast. I wouldn't mind, he said, if they came. Elias looked at him. Something moved across his face, slow and complicated. Your mama might have a say in that, he said. I know, said Luke, but I thought you should know I wouldn't mind. He slid off the hay bale and walked out of the barn, back toward the house, with the focused purposefulness of a boy who has said what he wanted to say and is now done saying it. Elias stood in the barn doorway for a long time after that, looking at nothing. Sunday came in gray and mean. The snow that had been threatening all week finally arrived in the afternoon. Not a blizzard, not yet, but the kind of steady, deliberate snowfall that coats everything evenly and quietly and doesn't care what you had planned. Martha stood at the window and watched it come down and thought about Monday morning in the way you think about a thing you've been trying not to think about. She'd made a decision. She hadn't told Elias yet. He came in from the barn around 3, stomping snow off his boots on the porch, and she poured him coffee without asking and set it on the table and sat across from him with her own. I can't let you sell the pelts, she said. He looked at her across the table. Martha, no, listen. She'd rehearsed this, and she needed to get through it before he interrupted her with something reasonable that she didn't want to hear. Those 4 years are yours. That's your children's future. That's the thing you've been working toward for 4 winters alone in the mountains, and I am not going to be the reason it disappears. She folded her hands on the table. I'll talk to Harold Finch. I know Harold. His wife Bessie and we went to school together years ago. Harold does what Mercer tells him to, but Harold is not a bad man. There might be an extension. There might be something the bank can do that Mercer hasn't told me about, because Mercer doesn't want solutions. He wants the property. There might be... Martha. His voice was quiet and firm. Harold Finch is not going to risk his position at that bank over a friendship his wife has from 20 years ago. You know that. Maybe not, but I have to try it first. And if it doesn't work? She looked at her hands. Then I figure out what comes next. But I'm not starting from a place where I've taken something from you that you spent 4 years building. He was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the snow came down steadily against the window. You're stubborn, he said. Extremely, she agreed. Something in his expression shifted. Not softening exactly. More like a man who has been pushing against a wall and discovered, unexpectedly, that the wall has its own reasons for standing where it is, and those reasons are respectable. All right, he said, you go see Harold Finch tomorrow morning, early, before Mercer gets to him. I plan to. He nodded, looked at his coffee, then, carefully, without looking up, and if you need to fall back, if it doesn't work, I need you to let me make that choice. Not have it made for me. She met his eyes when he looked up. If it comes to that, she said, we decide together. He studied her face for a moment, like he was checking whether she meant it. She did, and apparently it showed, because he nodded again and picked up his coffee and didn't say anything more about it. Rosie appeared in the doorway of the kitchen, sock-footed and suspicious, looking between the 2 adults at the table. Why is everyone being serious? She asked. Because it's Sunday, Martha said. Sunday is serious. Luke says Sunday is boring. Luke is often right, Elias said, and Rosie accepted this with the satisfaction of someone who likes to hear their older sibling criticized, and went back to whatever she'd been doing. Martha looked at the table between her hands and felt, for just a moment, something that she'd been without for long enough that she'd stopped expecting to feel it again. She couldn't name it exactly. It wasn't happiness. The circumstances were too raw for that word. It wasn't safety. Too much was still unresolved. It was something closer to the sensation of not being entirely alone in a problem, and discovering that that alone changes the weight of the problem significantly, even when the problem is exactly as large as it was before. It wasn't small, that feeling. She held it carefully, the way you hold something that might not last. She went to see Harold Finch Monday morning at 7 o'clock, before his office opened, and knocked on the door of his house, which was attached to the bank building on the town's main street. Bessie Finch answered the door and looked at Martha with an expression that contained both genuine warmth and a complicated kind of guilt, and she said, "Oh, Martha, come in," and squeezed her hand and called to Harold in the back. Harold came out in his vest, holding a piece of toast he hadn't finished, and his face when he saw her was the face of a man who has been dreading a conversation and is now having it. "Martha," he said, "I wasn't expecting—" "I know," she said. "I'm sorry to come early. Can we talk?" They sat at the Finch's kitchen table, and Bessie made herself scarce in the pointed way of a woman who knows this isn't her conversation but wants it to go well. Martha laid out what she had, which wasn't much. The ranch in better repair than it had been in 2 years, a worker who had asked for nothing in exchange for his labor, 2 children who had nowhere else to go if they lost the property, and no $1,100. Harold listened. He ate his toast. He looked at the table between them. "Mercer holds 40% of the bank," he said at last. "You understand what that means?" "I do." "It means my room to move is very small, Martha. I want you to understand that. It's not that I—" He stopped, looked at his plate. "The note is legitimate. The debt is real. I can't make it not real. I know. What I can do—" He stopped again, seemed to be measuring something inside himself. "What I can potentially do is rewrite the payment schedule. If the total isn't available today, but a substantial partial payment is made, I can potentially argue to the board that the note is being honored in good faith and delay the foreclosure action." He looked up at her. "But substantial means substantial, Martha. It means more than half. And it means Mercer agrees, which means either he doesn't know I've done it until it's done, or he agrees," Martha said. "Mercer is not going to agree." "I know," she said. She thanked Harold. She shook his hand. She walked out of the bank into the cold Monday morning where the snow from yesterday had frozen overnight and everything was hard and glittering and unforgiving. Elias was waiting with the wagon on the far side of the street, the mules patient and still in the cold. He'd known she would want a way back quickly, whatever happened, and he'd brought it without being asked. She crossed the street and climbed up and sat beside him, and he didn't say anything right away, just waited. "More than half," she said. "If we had more than half, Harold could potentially delay the filing." Elias looked straight ahead. "More than half of $1,100, he said, "is $550. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then he picked up the reins. "The Silver Fox," he said, almost to himself. "The merchant in Carver's Crossing offered me $400 last month. The wolf furs. $350 for the pair, maybe $400. That's enough. That's more than enough." He didn't look at her. "I'd still have the ermine and the mountain lion." "Elias." "Martha." He said her name the same way she'd said his, quietly, with a kind of finality that wasn't unkind. "You said we decide together." She looked at him, the line of his jaw, the way he held the reins with a looseness that came from knowing you didn't need to grip hard to be in control. "You'd still have enough to get them?" she asked. "Cal and Ruth?" "Not right away," he said honestly. "I'd need to work through the winter. Spring, maybe, instead of now." He paused. "But they're safe with Ruth. My sister Ruth." He shook his head slightly. "Both Ruths in my life. Confusing." He glanced at her then, brief, and that almost smile was there again. "My sister's kept them 2 years. She can keep them through one more winter if she knows I'm coming in the spring. You'd be stuck here," she said, "through winter, with us." "Would that be so bad?" She thought about Luke in the barn, asking if the man would be there for Christmas. She thought about Rosie, who had already started calling him Mr. Elias and bringing him small, interesting rocks she found in the yard. "No," she said, "it wouldn't be bad." He nodded once, like something was settled, and clicked to the mules, and they started back down the street toward the edge of town. They got halfway to the ranch before he said, without particular drama, just in the way of someone finishing a thought, "I'll go to Carver's Crossing this afternoon. Talk to the merchant. If he wants the fox, we'll have the money by morning." Martha held on to the side of the wagon as they jolted over a rut in the frozen road. "And then what?" she said. "And then we go back to Harold Finch with more than half, and we let Harold do what Harold is clearly wanting to do anyway." He kept his eyes on the road. "And then we get through winter." "And then?" He thought about that for a second. The mule's breath made small clouds in the cold air, steady and rhythmic. "And then spring," he said simply. "One thing at a time." She'd heard him say it before, that same three-word answer, and it had steadied her then too. Maybe that was the thing about it. It wasn't wisdom exactly. It wasn't comfort. It was just the simple, unglamorous truth that the only path through a hard thing is through it. One step, one day, one decision. She looked out at the frozen prairie on either side of the road, at the flat white sky and the dark line of the distant tree line, and the thin gray smoke rising from the chimney of a homestead half a mile off, and she thought, this is not over. Monday is not over yet, and Mercer is still out there, and nothing about this is safe yet. But she was not sitting at that kitchen table alone doing arithmetic with an empty bucket. That was something. That was she was discovering quite a lot. Elias came back from Carver's Crossing before dark. She heard the mules in the yard and came to the door, and he climbed down and reached into his coat and pulled out a folded envelope and held it out to her. His face didn't tell her anything one way or the other, which she was learning was just the way his face worked. She opened the envelope. $620, counted out in bills of varying age, folded together with the careful neatness of a transaction that had been conducted seriously. She looked up at him. "He wanted the fox and one of the wolves," Elias said. "I told him the wolf was a pear or nothing. He took the pear." He was very still. "It wasn't easy to hand them over." "I know," she said. "I want you to know that. Not because I want credit for it. Just, I want you to know that it was a thing that cost me something, so you don't think I did it lightly." "I never thought you did anything lightly," she said. He looked at her for a moment, just looked. Then Rosie appeared from inside, demanding to know where he'd been and whether he'd seen anything interesting on the road, and the moment dissolved into the ordinary noise of children and evening chores and supper to be made. But Martha held the envelope in both hands all the way back to the kitchen, and she was very careful with it, the way you're careful with something that belongs to someone else and has been given to you anyway, offered freely from a place in a person's life they didn't have to open. Tuesday morning, she walked back into Harold Finch's bank with $620 and set it on the counter. Harold counted it twice. He looked at her. He looked at the money. He picked up his pen. Gideon Mercer arrived at the bank 45 minutes later, just as Harold was completing the paperwork for the modified payment schedule. Martha was still sitting in the chair across from Harold's desk when the door opened and Mercer walked in, and the expression on his face when he saw her. When he understood, in the space of 2 seconds, exactly what he was looking at, was something she would hold on to for a long time. Not because she enjoyed it exactly, because it meant it was real. Because his fury made it real in a way that paperwork alone couldn't. "Harold," he said very quietly. Harold kept his pen moving. "The note is being honored in good faith, Gideon. The board will review the modified schedule next week." He said it to the paper, not to Mercer. His hand was not quite steady, but it kept moving. "That's within my authority." Mercer's eyes moved to Martha, cold and flat and recalibrating. She met his gaze and didn't look away. "This isn't over," he said. "It never is," she said. He left. The door didn't slam. He was too controlled for that. But it closed with a firmness that said everything the slam would have said. Harold finished writing, blotted the ink, and slid the papers across to her. "He's going to make trouble," Harold said quietly. "I know. More trouble than this." He met her eyes for the first time all morning. "I'm sorry I can't do more, Martha. Genuinely." "You did what you could," she said. "That's not nothing, Harold." She picked up the papers and walked out into the cold, And this time there was no wagon waiting, because Elias was back at the ranch fixing the loft ladder which had been broken since September, and she had ridden into town alone. She stood on the sidewalk in the thin winter sunlight and read the papers once, carefully, and then folded them and put them in her coat pocket close to her chest and started the walk to where she'd tied her horse. One thing at a time, one day at a time. But she was still here. The ranch was still hers. And Elias Boone was back at her property right now, in the cold, fixing a ladder she hadn't asked him to fix, because he'd noticed it was broken and decided it needed doing. She untied the horse and mounted up and turned toward home. The sky to the north had gone that particular flat white again, the color that meant more snow coming. She rode toward it anyway. The snow came hard that night, not the polite decorative kind that settled on fence posts and made the valley look like something out of a painting. This was the real thing, the kind that had teeth, that packed itself against the north side of every structure and found every gap in every wall and made the horses in the barn restless and anxious in the particular way animals get when the weather turns genuinely dangerous. Martha woke at 2 a.m. to the sound of the windmill groaning under the load of it and lay in the dark, listening, cataloging the sounds. The house made the way she'd taught herself to do in the first months after Thomas died, when she'd had to learn quickly which sounds were normal and which sounds meant something needed her attention right now. The windmill was groaning but holding. The roof was solid. Elias had made sure of that. The east wall had a rattle she'd have to look at in the morning, but it was old and familiar, and she knew it wasn't structural. She lay there for a while, listening to the storm do its work. Somewhere between 2 and 3, she heard movement in the barn, the low, brief sound of boots on frozen ground, and she got up and looked out the window and saw the orange dot of a lantern moving toward the building. Elias. Checking on the animals in the middle of the night without being asked, the way you do when you understand that the animals are not yours, but the cost of losing them falls on someone you've come to care about. She watched the lantern light move through the gap in the barn doors and then disappear inside. She stood at the window for a few minutes, the cold coming off the glass in a steady wave, and then went back to bed. She didn't sleep, but she was less alone in her wakefulness than she'd been in a long time, and that was its own kind of rest. The storm broke by morning, but left behind it a cold that was serious in a way the valley hadn't seen in 3 years. The thermometer on the porch read 14 degrees at sunup and hadn't moved much by noon. Martha's breath came out in thick clouds when she crossed the yard, and the snow was crusted hard enough to walk on, which made the chores faster but the ground underneath treacherous. Elias had already fed the cattle and broken the ice on the water trough by the time she came out. I was working on the east fence when she brought him coffee, the stretch that ran along the property's northern border, where 2 posts had been weakened by the previous week's wet snow and had leaned inward overnight just enough to concern her. He was tamping dirt around the base of the second post, working it back to vertical with a methodical patience that didn't quite hide how cold his hands were. She'd noticed he rarely wore gloves when he was doing fine work, said he couldn't feel what he was doing through the leather. She handed him the coffee, and he drank half of it before he spoke. "Post's going to hold," he said. "The other one I'll need to replace in spring. Rot got into the base, but it's not going anywhere before April." "Good." She stood beside him, looking out across the north pasture. The snow stretched flat and white and enormous under a sky that had gone the bright hard blue that only happened in real cold. "Elias, what happened in town yesterday?" "Martha, let me say it." She'd been forming this in her head all night. "Mercer isn't done. He said so himself, and he's not a man who says things he doesn't mean. Harold buying us time isn't a solution. It's a delay." She looked at him. "I need you to know that. I don't want you investing more of yourself into this situation under the impression that we've solved something, because I don't believe we have." He looked at her steadily. The cold had put color in his face, along his cheekbones and the bridge of his nose, the particular redness that fair-complexioned people got in serious weather. "I know," he said. "You know, and you're still here." "I know, and I'm still here," he confirmed, and said it without drama, without the weight of a grand declaration, just as a plain fact that he was offering her the same way he'd handed her the papers from the windmill repair. "Here, this is what's true. Take it." She looked at her boots for a moment. "Why does Mercer want this specific piece of land? He's got 300 acres. He's got the grain supply. What does our land give him that he doesn't already have?" Elias had clearly been thinking about this. He answered without hesitating. The creek, he said. Your southern creek runs year-round. His western pasture goes dry every August. He's been hauling water for his cattle for the last 2 summers. He looked toward the south where the creek ran, invisible now under snow and ice, but there. A man with his operation and a water problem. Your land isn't about the land. It's about solving something he doesn't want to keep solving. Martha stared at him. How do you know about his western pasture? Talked to a man named Garvey at the feed store last week. He supplies Mercer's operation and doesn't like him much. People who don't like someone will tell you a lot if you ask the right questions. He finished the coffee and handed her back the cup. That's not Mercer's only reason, I expect. Men like him collect things, land, influence, other people's problems. But the creek is what makes your land worth the trouble he's going to. She turned this over in her mind. It was information, real information, and that made it valuable in a way that she hadn't had much of lately. Then he's going to keep coming, she said. Yes, Elias said. He's going to keep coming, and the modification Harold gave us buys time but doesn't change the math. You still owe money. He still has leverage. He crouched down to check the base of the fence post one more time, pressing on it from different angles. What we have is time. What we need to do with the time is figure out how to change the math. How do you change the math when you don't have money? He stood back up. You raise money. Elias, I've been trying to Not by yourself, he said. There are ranchers in this valley who have dealt with Mercer, who've lost things to him or come close. You're not the only one he's circled. He looked at her. I've been talking to people in town. Garvey at the feed store, a man named Pete Sutherland who farms the northeast quarter, a woman, widow like you, named Clara Hobbs, who lost her husband's land to Mercer 18 months ago through a deal that everyone in town knows wasn't square, but no one did anything about. He paused. People are angry, Martha. They've been quietly angry for a long time. They just haven't had a reason to do something with it. She looked at him for a long moment. And you think I'm the reason? I think this situation might be, he said carefully. I think when people watch a woman with 2 children get pushed off her land for the second time in the same valley, a woman whose husband built that land with his hands, it lights something that's been sitting there waiting. She felt something complicated move through her. Not quite hope. She'd learned to be careful with hope, but something adjacent to it. Something that felt like possibility, which was not the same thing as certainty and never pretended to be. You've been doing all this, she said, talking to people, planning. Thinking, he corrected. Not planning. There's a difference. I didn't want to say anything until I knew whether there was anything real in it. And is there? He looked at the fence post, at the sky, back at her. Come Saturday, he said, I think you should invite some people to supper. It was not a small thing to feed people when you had almost nothing, but Martha Calloway had grown up watching her own mother perform the specific frontier miracle of making a meal that was good enough to make guests feel welcome without revealing how thin the margins were, and she understood that the meal itself was secondary to the table, to the fact of people sitting around it together, which was what she needed. She sent Luke into town Thursday with a list of names and a note, and Luke came back Friday evening with responses from 11 families, which was more than she'd expected, and enough that she had to move the table to the center of the room and add the kitchen bench along one side. Elias shot 2 rabbits Friday morning. She made the stew with dried vegetables and everything she had that was worth putting in, and she baked bread and she borrowed a jar of preserves from the shelf she'd been saving. And by Saturday evening, the house smelled like something that had not been the smell of this house in a very long time. Pete Sutherland arrived first, a large, sunburned man with a handshake that Martha had to brace herself against, and his wife Agnes, who brought a pie without being asked and set it on the counter like a person establishing a position. Then the Moorfield brothers, who farmed adjacent land to the east, both single, both taciturn, who shook hands with everyone and sat together on the bench and said very little but paid close attention. Clara Hobbs came alone, a small woman in her 60s with gray hair wound up tight and eyes that had been through things and come out the other side sharpened rather than dimmed. Garvey from the feed store, a man named Doc Emmett, who was not a doctor. It was just a nickname from a card game 15 years ago that had stuck, who was the closest thing the valley had to a general fix-it man, able to build or repair almost anything. 4 other families, smaller operations, people Martha knew by face and name, but had never had occasion to sit at a table with. Elias sat at the far end of the table, quiet through the first part of the meal, letting people eat and talk about the weather and the price of grain and everything except what they were there to talk about. He was good at that, at understanding that a room needed time to warm before you asked it to do something. It was Clara Hobbs who opened it. Of course it was Clara. "I assume we're not just here for the rabbit," she said, setting down her spoon and looking at Martha directly. "So, what's the situation?" Martha told them. The whole of it. The debt, the modified payment schedule, what Elias had said about the creek, what Monday had looked like in Harold Finch's office with Mercer standing in the doorway. She didn't dramatize it, and she didn't understate it, because these were people who lived close enough to the edge themselves that they would know immediately if she was doing either. When she finished, the table was quiet for a moment. Pete Sutherland looked at Elias. "You're the one talked to Garvey." "That's right," Elias said. "He told me," Pete said. Said there was a man asking questions about Mercer that weren't idle questions. He studied Elias with the appraising look of a man who made decisions about people quickly and usually correctly. "What's your stake in this?" "I'm working the ranch," Elias said. "Martha's agreed to take in my children when I bring them home in the spring. That makes this situation somewhat personal." "Somewhat," Pete repeated with a tone that suggested he thought the word was doing a lot of lifting. "His pelts paid for the partial payment to the bank," Martha said. She hadn't planned to say it, but she said it because it was true, and it was relevant, and she was not going to sit at her own table and let Elias understate what he'd done. 4 years of trapping work. He put it toward my debt without being asked. The table absorbed this. Clara Hobbs looked at Elias with an expression that recalibrated several things at once. "Mercer is going to come back," Elias said to the table. "The modification buys time. It doesn't close the door. He's going to find another way to apply pressure, another legal angle, another debt, something. Men like him are patient when they think they're going to win eventually." He paused. "What changes that calculation is if they stop believing they're going to win." "How do you make Mercer stop believing he's going to win?" one of the Moorfield brothers said. It was the first time either of them had spoken. "You make the cost of continuing higher than the cost of stopping," Elias said. "Right now it costs him almost nothing to keep pushing. He files papers, he waits, he applies pressure. What does it cost him? Lawyers' fees he can afford." He looked around the table. "But if the Valley is paying attention, if people are watching what he does and saying so, if his business dealings become something that other people are actively aware of and actively discussing, that's a different calculation. Men who operate the way he operates need a certain amount of quiet to work in." "You're talking about making noise," Garvey said. "I'm talking about making it expensive to be Gideon Mercer in this valley," Elias said. "Not violent, not illegal, just visible, organized." He looked at Pete Sutherland. "You know people the county over who've had dealings with him. You said so to Garvey." Pete's jaw tightened. "I know people." "And Clara?" Elias looked at her carefully. "You lost your husband's land. You said in court it wasn't right, and the judge sided with Mercer anyway. But you said it." "I said it," Clara confirmed in a voice that had never forgotten it. "If you'd say it again," Elias said, "publicly. To the county newspaper in Harlan, not here where Mercer has influence, but in Harlan. And if Pete's people from the county over said similar things, and if Martha files a formal complaint with the Territorial Land Office about Mercer's acquisition practices." He held up a hand. "None of that solves the debt. I want to be clear. None of it makes the money appear. But it changes the atmosphere. It makes Mercer's next move harder to make quietly." Doc Emmett, who had been sitting back with his arms folded, said, "What solves the debt?" Silence. The honest silence of a room where no one has a comfortable answer. Then Agnes Sutherland, Pete's wife, who had not said a word since she set the pie on the counter, spoke quietly from the end of the bench. "We could raise it," she said. Everyone looked at her. "Not me alone," she said. "All of us. Between what's at this table." She looked at Pete. "We talked about this before we came." Pete rubbed his jaw. "We talked about it," he agreed, in the tone of a man who had agreed to something he wasn't entirely sure about and was now either going to honor it or not. "How much?" Martha asked. Her voice was very steady. She had practiced that steadiness for 2 years, and it still didn't come naturally, not when things mattered. "Enough for the remaining balance, maybe," Agnes said. "Not as a gift, as a loan. Between neighbors. paid back over time, from the cattle production, from whatever the ranch produces. She looked at Martha. Thomas Calloway built things right. You've kept things together when most people wouldn't have. That's not a bad investment. Martha looked at the table. The bowl of stew in front of her, half eaten. The bread she'd made at 4 in the morning. The jar of preserves she'd been saving. She was very close to crying. She didn't cry. I don't want charity, she said. It's not charity, Pete said, and now his voice had settled into the firmness of a decision made. It's a loan from neighbors who should have been paying more attention to what was happening at the edge of this valley for the past year. That's a different thing. He looked at her directly. You let us help. Clara Hobbs reached across the table and put her hand on top of Martha's, briefly and without sentimentality. Let us help, she said. No. The week that followed was the kind of week that doesn't show up in the way people later describe things, because it was all logistics and cold and uncomfortable conversations, and a great deal of detail work that was tedious and necessary, and not particularly dramatic. But Martha lived it in a state of sustained, careful hope, the kind that doesn't let itself get too loud, that keeps one hand on the practical so it doesn't get pulled away by the emotional. Elias drove her to Harlan on Wednesday, 2 days after the supper, because the county newspaper office was there, and Clara Hobbs was meeting them there along with a man named Vernon Cross, who Pete Sutherland had brought in from the East County, a farmer who had lost grazing rights to Mercer 4 years ago through a legal maneuver that everyone around him had called unfair and no one had called unfair in print. The newspaper editor was a young man, younger than Martha expected, with spectacles and ink on his left hand and the particular energy of someone who had been waiting for a story worth caring about. He listened to Clara for 40 minutes. He listened to Vernon Cross for 20. He asked Martha careful, specific questions and wrote everything down in a notebook that Thursday, he said, I want to be clear. This is not an accusation. This is an account of what happened, told by people it happened to. Mr. Mercer will have an opportunity to respond. He won't respond, Clara said. Men like him don't respond to newspapers. They respond to lawyers. Maybe, the editor said, but lawyers respond to newspapers. Clara looked at him for a moment, then nodded, once, like something had been confirmed. On the way back from Harlan, with the frozen road running straight and empty before them, Martha sat beside Elias in the wagon and felt the specific exhaustion of a person who has spent the day doing things that matter. You think this will work? She asked. I think it'll help, he said. I don't know if it'll work. Those are different things. You're always honest about that. Seems like the only useful thing to be. She pulled her coat tighter against the wind. Elias, when this is done, when the debt is cleared, if it gets cleared, you should go for your children before spring. You shouldn't wait. He didn't answer right away. The mules moved steadily through the cold. Cal and Ruth have waited 2 years, he said finally. Another month or two. Isn't something a father who misses them should accept if he doesn't have to, she said. He was quiet again. The road stretched ahead. The ranch needs you to go get your children, she said, and come back. She paused. If you want to come back. He looked at her then, sideways, in the way he had that was careful without being guarded. You sure about that? He asked. She wasn't entirely sure about anything. She hadn't been entirely sure about anything since the November afternoon she'd opened her door to a stranger with an axe and 2 mules and a proposition that should have seemed absurd. But she'd learned something in the past weeks that she hadn't known before, or had known theoretically and now knew in her body, in the way you know things that have been tested against real conditions. She'd learned that the measure of a person wasn't whether they had doubts. It was whether the doubts stopped them. I'm sure, she said. He turned back to the road. They drove the rest of the way home in a quiet that was comfortable in the way only certain kinds of quiet can be. Not the absence of things to say, but the presence of an understanding that didn't need saying. What? Mercer's response came not on Thursday, when the newspaper ran, but on Friday morning. And it came not through lawyers, not through Harold Finch, not through any of the channels Martha had been watching for. It came through her cattle. She was in the kitchen when Luke came running in from the barn, breathless, his face white under the cold reddened cheeks, and the sound of him running, Luke, who did not run without reason, brought her to her feet before he'd made it through the door. The south pasture gate, he said. It's open. The cattle are out. She was in her coat and boots before the sentence was finished. The gate wasn't just open. The latch had been cut, clean through, with something sharp and deliberate, the kind of cut that didn't happen by accident or by weather or by a latch wearing through from age. The kind of cut someone makes on purpose, in the dark, when they don't want witnesses. 8 cattle were missing. She could see the tracks in the snow leading south toward the creek and beyond, scattered across a wide area by something that had spooked them, a sound maybe, or someone deliberately driving them. And in the early morning light, with the temperature sitting at 15 degrees and more snow coming, getting them back was going to be a matter of hours of cold, hard work across difficult terrain. Elias was already reading the tracks when she got there. 3, maybe 4 hours ago, he said, before dawn. He crouched at the cut latch, looked at it, didn't touch it. This was deliberate. I know it was deliberate. He stood up. I'll go south toward the creek. If they went that way, they'll have stopped at the water. I'll take the East Ridge. They sometimes drift there when they're spooked. He looked at her. Take Luke. Luke's 11. Luke knows this land better than most adults, he said, and he wasn't wrong, and she knew he wasn't wrong. She took Luke. They rode east while Elias went south, and the cold pressed down on them with a humorless insistence, and Luke rode beside her without complaining, scanning the terrain with those steady eyes that missed very little. They found 3 cattle in a gully off the East Ridge, standing together with the miserable patience of cattle who have gone somewhere they didn't intend to go. Martha and Luke drove them back slowly, which took an hour and a half on ground that was iced under the snow in places and treacherous. Elias came back with 4 more 2 hours after that, his coat soaked through from where he'd had to wade into the creek shallows to turn one that was heading the wrong direction. 1 cow was still missing, a good milker, one of the 2 she had left. They spent the rest of the afternoon looking. Elias went back out after the light started failing, which Martha told him not to do and which he did anyway, and came back at dusk without the cow. His face when he came in was very controlled, which meant he was angry in the specific way he got angry. Not explosive, not obvious, just compressed and quiet and set. She's gone, he said. Past the south fence line. Could be anywhere. Martha stood at the stove, stirring soup she'd put on hours ago. She heard what he said. She kept stirring. That's half my milk production, she said. I know. That was deliberate too, not just the gate, driving them south toward the creek. Someone knew which way they'd go. Someone who spent time watching this property, Elias said. She turned around. Can we prove it was Mercer? He looked at her honestly. No. She turned back to the stove. She heard Elias sit down heavily at the kitchen table, heard the scrape of the chair and the sound of a man who has been outside in serious cold for most of a day, finally stopping. He's escalating, she said. Yes. This is a message. He's telling me the newspaper piece didn't scare him. It made him angrier. Yes. She kept stirring. The soup was probably already done, but she needed something to do with her hands. What do we do? She asked. Not helplessly. She didn't have the energy for helpless. More like someone asking a practical question that needed a practical answer. Elias was quiet for a moment. I'm going to talk to the sheriff, he said. Tomorrow morning. The cutlatch. That's property damage. That's a crime. I can't prove who did it, but I can put the report on record. And I'm going to talk to Pete Sutherland, because Pete's got 200 acres south of yours. And if someone was driving cattle across his land in the dark, there might be someone who saw something. He paused. And I'm going to do one other thing. She turned around. He was looking at his hands on the table, those cracked, work-hardened hands. I'm going to write to my sister tonight, he said. I'm going to tell her it's going to be a little longer. He looked up at her. I told you I was staying through winter. I'm staying through winter. Elias, my children are safe, he said. You're not, right now. That's the math. He said it flatly, like it was obvious, like it had already been decided and he wasn't inviting debate. Something rose in her throat. She swallowed it down. I'll pay you back for every day, she said. I know you will, he said. That's not why I'm doing it. She knew it wasn't. That was the thing about Elias Boone. There was no performance in what he did. He wasn't building a debt, wasn't accumulating goodwill to spend later. He just looked at a situation and decided what was right, and then did it. With the same straightforward efficiency he brought to fence posts and windmill gears and barn roofs. It was one of the most maddening and most steadying things about him. She dished up the soup. The sheriff's name was Aldous Crane, and he was neither a bad man nor a particularly brave one. He was the kind of lawman who kept the peace in situations where the peace wanted to keep itself and grew extremely uncomfortable when powerful interests pointed in the same direction as likely wrongdoing. He listened to Elias describe the cutlatch with the careful attention of a man who is paying attention and wishes he wasn't. "I'll file a report," he said. "That's all?" Elias asked. "I can file a report, Mr. Boone. I can't arrest a man on the basis of a cutlatch and a suspicion." He looked uncomfortable. "If you had a witness, I'll find a witness," Elias said. Crane looked at him. "If Gideon Mercer is involved in this—" "I didn't say his name," Elias pointed out. Crane's jaw tightened. "I know you didn't. I'm telling you that if a prominent member of this community is accused of property crimes, I need more than a cutlatch and a missing cow before I can do anything that will hold up." He paused. "File the report. Get me a witness. Then we talk." It was not satisfying. Elias walked out of the sheriff's office into the cold morning and stood on the sidewalk and took a long, slow breath. Pete Sutherland was waiting for him outside with his hands in his coat pockets. "Well," Pete said. "File the report. Find a witness," Elias said. "I've got something," Pete said. "My hired man, Delbert. He sleeps in the bunkhouse which faces south. He saw lights moving along the south fence line of your property around 3 in the morning. Didn't think much of it at the time. Thinks now he should have." Elias looked at him. "Will he say that to Crane?" "He'll say whatever I tell him to say," Pete said. Then, seeing Elias's expression, added quickly, "I mean, he'll say what he saw, which is the truth. Delbert saw what he saw. I'm just saying he'll tell it if I ask him to." "Get him to Crane this afternoon," Elias said. Pete nodded. Then, "Mercer's going to know we're pushing back." "He already knows." "I mean, he's going to know it's organized," Pete said. "Not just Martha, not just you. He's going to know it's the valley, and he's going to respond to that. You ready for whatever that looks like?" Elias looked down the main street of the town, at the storefronts and the frozen mud of the road, and the ordinary business of an ordinary winter morning in a small valley town. "I've been in the mountains alone for 4 years," he said, responded to whatever that looked like. "I think I can manage." Pete Sutherland almost smiled. "All right," he said. "All right." It was Clara Hobbs who brought the news on Thursday, 8 days after the cattle incident. She drove herself, which she always did, and she came in the front door with the cold chasing her and a newspaper under her arm, and an expression that was complicated enough that Martha felt her stomach drop before Clara had said a word. "Good news and bad news," Clara said, setting the paper on the table. "Bad news first," Martha said. "Mercer's filed an injunction. His lawyer, the one from the city, not the local one, filed in county court to challenge Harold's modification to the payment schedule. Claims Harold acted outside his authority." Clara's mouth was a firm line. "Which means the modified schedule is in question, which means the foreclosure clock may restart." Martha sat down. "And the good news?" Elias asked from across the table. Clara put her hand on the newspaper. "The Harlan County Register. The article was on the front page, below the fold. Not the headline, but visible." Martha could see Clara Hobbs' name and Vernon Cross's name and her own name in the print without reading the details. "3 other people called the editor after the piece ran," Clara said. "People with their own stories about Mercer. People from 2 counties over." She tapped the paper. "He's running a follow-up piece next week. And the Territorial Land Office sent a letter to Martha's address. Arrived this morning. I brought it with me, acknowledging receipt of her complaint and indicating that a review has been opened." Martha looked at the letter Clara slid across the table, opened it, read it twice. A review. Not a decision, not a resolution. A review, which meant someone in an official position somewhere had looked at what had been submitted and decided it warranted further attention. It wasn't enough. She knew it wasn't enough. But Mercer's lawyer had filed the injunction because something was working, because the noise was reaching somewhere he didn't want noise to reach, because Clara Hobbs had sat in a newspaper office and told the truth out loud, and 3 other people had called in with their own truths, and somewhere a land office clerk had read a complaint and decided it wasn't nothing. She looked at Elias. He was looking at the injunction document Clara had brought, reading it with the focused attention of someone who was not a lawyer but had learned to parse legal language out of necessity. "How long to challenge the injunction?" he asked Clara. The lawyer in Harlan says 2 weeks, maybe 3, to get a hearing date. Could go either way. But it buys time. It buys time, Clara confirmed. 2 weeks, maybe 3. And then a hearing, and then whatever came after a hearing, and somewhere in there Mercer would find another angle because that was what men like Mercer did. They found another angle. Martha looked at the Territorial Land Office letter, official and careful and non-committal, and nevertheless real. She thought about a woman alone with a bucket of milk and 2 hungry children and 14 degrees on the porch thermometer and no one coming. She thought about how 3 weeks ago that had been the entire picture. She looked around her kitchen, at Clara Hobbs' no-nonsense face and the newspaper on the table and the letter in her hands. At Elias, reading the injunction with his brow furrowed and his coffee going cold. The picture had changed, not resolved, changed. Still hard, still uncertain, still with Mercer out there, maneuvering with the patience and resources of someone who believed he had more staying power than the people he was pushing against. Maybe he did. Martha couldn't be certain he didn't. But she looked at Elias Boone across her kitchen table, this man who had come down from the mountains with holes in his boots and 4 years of work in a bag and offered to save her ranch in exchange for a promise to feed his children. And she thought about what that had cost him and what he'd done with it anyway. She thought about Luke in the barn with his one almost smile and his careful questions. She thought about Pete Sutherland's handshake and Agnes's pie. And Delbert, the hired man who'd seen lights moving in the dark and was willing to say so. She folded the letter and set it down. "All right," she said. Clara looked at her. "All right," Martha said again. "We fight the injunction. We wait for the land office. We keep making noise." She looked at Clara, then at Elias. "We don't give him the quiet he needs to work in." Elias held her gaze for a moment. Then he set down the injunction document and picked up his coffee and looked out the window at the winter-white yard and the fences that were solid now, fixed, holding against whatever came. Outside, Rosie was attempting to convince Luke to help her build something in the snow that she claimed was a fort but looked more like a slowly collapsing pile. Luke was objecting with the patience of a boy who had learned to manage his sister's ambitions and losing. Elias watched them for a second. "They're going to get cold," he said. "They always do," Martha said. "They always come in when they're ready." He nodded and drank his coffee, and Clara Hobbs spread the newspaper flat on the table and pointed to the follow-up article she'd been told was coming, and they bent their heads over it together in the cold afternoon light, planning the next thing, and then the thing after that. The injunction hearing was set for the second Tuesday of December, which gave them 18 days, and Mercer used every one of them. He didn't come to the ranch again himself. That was the thing about Gideon Mercer. He was too careful, too aware of what a visible move would look like in the current atmosphere, with the newspaper piece running and the Territorial Land Office letter sitting on file somewhere in a government building. He stayed away from the Callaway property with the deliberate restraint of a man who understood that being seen was now a liability. But he didn't stay still. The first thing that happened was that the feed store in town stopped extending credit to Martha's account. She found this out on a Monday morning when she went in to order a supplemental grain for the cattle through the lean weeks ahead. And Garvey came out from behind the counter with the expression of a man delivering bad news he didn't choose to deliver. "Mercer owns a quarter interest in the supply chain I order through," Garvey said, low and quick, like someone who expected to be overheard. "Word came down Friday. Any account associated with the Callaway property goes cash only, effective immediately." He looked genuinely pained. "Martha, I'm sorry. If it were up to me—" "It's not up to you," she said. "I know that." She walked out with $43 in her pocket and a winter that was going to need a great deal more grain than that. The second thing happened to Pete Sutherland. His supply contract for the grain cooperative, the one that moved a substantial portion of his harvest each season, was suddenly under review, pending what the cooperative's manager described as a routine audit of terms. Pete had been on that contract for 9 years without a single audit. He told Elias about it Thursday evening, standing in Martha's yard with his hat in his hands, and his jaw was set in the way of a man who is angry and trying to decide how angry he's allowed to be. "He's going after the people around me," Martha said. She was standing in the barn doorway listening. "That's what this is." "That's what this is," Pete confirmed. "Pete, I don't want—" "Don't," Pete said. "Don't say it." He put his hat back on. I've been watching Mercer operate in this valley for 15 years, watching him and doing nothing. I'm not going to stop now because he audited a contract. He looked at Elias. What do we do about it? Elias had been quiet through this. He'd been quiet a lot lately. The particular quiet of someone doing continuous, invisible calculation, running numbers and angles and possibilities through their head without announcing it. The hearing's in 2 weeks, he said. Between now and then, Mercer is going to keep applying pressure to everyone connected to Martha. He's hoping one of you pulls back. He's hoping the show of unity from the supper turns out to be softer than it looked. He looked at Pete. Is it? Pete looked back at him for a long moment. It's not, Pete said. Then the answer to what we do is the same as it's been. We show up to the hearing. We get every person in that room who has a story. We make it very difficult for a judge to ignore what's in front of him. He paused. And I'm going to go talk to Vernon Cross again because Vernon said last week he knew of 2 more people in the East County who'd had dealings with Mercer's land acquisition practices. I want those people at the hearing. You're building a case, Pete said. I'm building a room full of people who have something to say, Elias said. Whether that's a case depends on the judge. The judge assigned to the hearing was a man named Theodore Ames who rode the circuit out of the county seat and who Martha had never appeared before. She asked around carefully and got a mixed picture. Clara Hobbs said he was honest but conservative, meaning he followed the letter of what was in front of him and didn't much like being pushed toward conclusions he hadn't arrived at himself. Doc Emmett, who'd been in front of Ames once in a property boundary dispute, said he was fair but slow, that he'd sit with a thing a long time before he decided, and that pushing him only made him slower. Don't push him, Doc Emmett said. Present the facts and let them sit. Martha repeated this to Elias that evening. He nodded like it confirmed something. The lawyer in Harlan, he said. Breckenridge. Is he good? Good? Clara says he's the best in the county. Can we afford him? The question landed the way it always landed, practical and heavy and impossible to avoid. They looked at each other across the kitchen table. The neighbor's loan, Martha said. Pete and Agnes put in $300. The Moorfields put in $75. Garvey put in $50. Clara Hobbs put in $100. She paused. Combined with what we had and what the cattle have been producing, it's enough for the balance on the note if the modification holds. If the modification gets thrown out and the original foreclosure clock restarts, all of that goes to the debt, and there's nothing left for a lawyer. Then Breckenridge needs to win the modification hearing, Elias said. He needs to win it, Martha agreed. Have you talked to him? Yesterday afternoon. He's confident. He said Harold's action was within standard banking authority and Mercer's lawyer is reaching. She heard the words come out and noticed she sounded steadier than she felt. He also said Mercer's city lawyer is very good and he wouldn't underestimate the reach. Elias looked at his hands on the table. I keep thinking about what it's costing Pete, he said. The audit. What it might cost Garvey if Mercer decides to push harder on the supply chain. He was quiet for a second. I asked people to stand with you, and they're standing, and I don't know what it's going to cost them before this is done. It was the first time she'd heard anything like doubt from him. Not panic, not despair. Just the honest weight of a man who had organized something and was now feeling the full gravity of having done so. They made their own choices, she said. People make choices when they're warm and sitting at a table, he said. Those choices feel different when the consequences start. Pete knew what the consequences might be before he agreed, she said. Clara knew. They're not children, Elias. They're people who've made decisions and they're living with them. She looked at him directly. The same way you did. He met her eyes, held them. Yeah, he said finally. Yeah. He pushed back from the table. I'm going to check on the barn. It's 9 o'clock. I know. He picked up his coat. I don't sleep well when I'm thinking. She understood that. She didn't sleep well either. She sat at the table after he left and listened to the house and thought about Theodore Ames and Breckenridge and the modification hearing and Pete Sutherland's supply contract. And after a while, Rosie appeared in the doorway in her nightgown, hair loose and face soft with half sleep. Mom? Go back to bed, sweetheart. I had a dream about the missing cow. What happened in the dream? Rosie considered this with the gravity of a 7-year-old processing narrative. She came back. She was just standing at the gate in the morning. That's a good dream, Martha said. Do you think she really will? Martha looked at her daughter's face. the hopefulness in it, uncalculated and completely genuine. "I think she might," she said, and meant it just enough to say it honestly. Rosie went back to bed. Martha sat at the table a little longer, then got up and banked the stove for the night. And when she went to the window before she went upstairs, she could see the faint glow of the lantern in the barn, still moving. The hearing was on a Tuesday, and the temperature was 6 degrees when they left the ranch before dawn. Elias drove. Martha sat beside him and held the folder of documents Breckenridge had prepared. Every paper relevant to the debt, the original note, Harold's modification, the timeline of payments and communications. She'd read through it 3 times the night before and still felt the anxiety of a person who is not in control of an outcome they desperately need. They picked up Clara Hobbs at her gate on the way, and Clara got into the back of the wagon with the expression of a woman going somewhere to do something unpleasant that nevertheless needs doing. The courthouse in the county seat was a 2-story brick building that smelled of wood smoke and old paper, and when they arrived there were already people in the hallway outside the hearing room. Pete Sutherland and Agnes, the Moorfield brothers. Vernon Cross, who had driven in from the East County. 2 people Martha didn't recognize but who Pete had vouched for. A man named Aldred who had lost grazing rights, and a woman named Mrs. Pemble who had a specific and detailed account of a Mercer land acquisition from 3 years back that Breckenridge had said was legally relevant. There were 8 people who had come to stand in a hallway in a cold courthouse on a 6-degree Tuesday morning because of something that had started with a supper in Martha's kitchen. She looked at them and felt something move through her that was not quite pride and not quite gratitude. Something larger than either, harder to name, something in the neighborhood of awe at what people could decide to be for each other when they actually decided. Breckenridge was already inside talking to the clerk. He came out and shook Martha's hand and gave the assembled group a quick, practiced assessment and nodded slightly to himself. "Good," he said. "This helps." "Can they come in?" Martha asked. "The hearing is open. They can sit in the gallery." He looked at the crowd again. "All of them in the gallery is better than I expected." Mercer arrived 20 minutes later with his city lawyer, a man named Galston, who wore a coat that cost more than Martha's monthly cattle production, and 2 other men whose function wasn't immediately clear, but whose presence communicated something about resources and deliberateness. Mercer looked at the people in the hallway with the controlled expression of a man recalibrating in real time. His eyes swept across the group, Pete, Clara, the Moorfields, Vernon Cross, and something flickered across his face too fast to name before he smoothed it back to neutral. He didn't speak to Martha. He walked past her like she wasn't there, which was a choice, and she understood it as what it was. Galston was good. She'd been warned and still found herself slightly unprepared for how good he was. The precision of his language, the way he cited every relevant precedent and order, the way he made Harold Finch's modification sound not merely irregular but almost reckless, an overreach of authority that put the bank's own legal standing at risk. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He was the kind of lawyer who made a judge feel like the reasonable conclusion was the one he was leading you toward, and you were just catching up. Breckenridge was methodical and grounded and clearly deeply familiar with the specific statutory language governing bank modifications in the territory. He cited 3 precedents of his own, older, less elegant cases, but solid. He made Harold's actions sound like exactly what it was. A standard procedure within acknowledged authority, applied in a situation that warranted it. The gallery was silent throughout. Martha sat at the plaintiff's table beside Breckenridge and kept her hands flat on her thighs and her face composed, the way she'd composed it in front of Mercer on her porch, and in front of Harold Finch in the bank, and in every other moment over the past 2 years when composure was the only asset she had full control of. Judge Ames asked questions, slow, careful questions. He asked Galston to walk him through the specific clause he was citing. He asked Breckenridge to address a counter-precedent Galston had raised. He looked at the documents for a long time without speaking. Then he said he was going to take the matter under advisement and issue a ruling within 10 days. 10 days. Breckenridge told her outside, quietly, that this was good, that Ames taking time meant he was weighing it seriously and not simply accepting the challenge outright, that if Galston's argument had been immediately convincing, he would have ruled on the spot. Martha nodded and said thank you and walked out into the 6-degree morning where Pete Sutherland was waiting and immediately asked how it went, and she said she didn't know yet, and he said all right, and put his hand briefly on her shoulder and took it away. Elias was with the wagon. He looked at her when she came out, and she shook her head slightly. Not bad news, just no news. And he nodded and helped Clara up into the back. They drove home mostly in silence, and the cold and the distance and the uncertainty sat with them the whole way, heavy and patient. The 10 days felt like a month. Elias filled them the only way he knew how, with work. He began building a proper chicken coop, since the existing one was a converted corner of the barn that had always been inadequate and was now dangerously cold. He reinforced the south gate with new hardware, better hardware, not just replacement, something that would genuinely be harder to cut without significant effort and noise. He dug a drainage channel along the barn's north side that Martha hadn't asked for, but had been causing problems in wet weather for 2 years. And he did it in frozen ground with a pick and a stubbornness that made Luke come and watch in the specific way he watched things he was trying to understand. "Why are you doing that one?" Luke asked on the second day. "We didn't talk about the drainage." "Noticed it last month," Elias said. He swung the pick. "Things like that don't get easier to fix if you wait." Luke was quiet for a moment. "Is that why you're working so hard right now, because of the hearing?" Elias stopped and looked at him. "What makes you think that?" "Because you always work harder when something's out of your control," Luke said. Just like that, plainly, the way 11-year-olds sometimes say the exact true thing without knowing how precise it is. Elias held the pick at his side and looked at the boy. "Yeah," he said. "That's probably right." Luke nodded like this was useful information, filed it, and went back to the fence post he'd been testing with the method Elias had shown him. Push at the base, feel for the give, know the difference between movement that means rot and movement that's just soft ground. He'd gotten good at it. He could read a fence line now the way some kids his age read a page. Martha watched from the kitchen window that afternoon, Luke at the fence, Elias in the ground, and thought about what her son had said, and thought that it was possible she'd been doing the same thing herself, that the sustained, controlled activity of the past weeks was at least partly her own way of not being still long enough to feel how frightened she was. She allowed herself to feel it for about 10 minutes, stood at the window and let it be real. The fear of losing the ranch, the fear of what happened to Luke and Rosie if she lost it, the fear of what it would mean for Elias, who had given up so much and stayed past the point where she could honestly justify asking him to. The fear, underneath all of it, that she had somehow built a life around another person too quickly, too close to the ground, without enough certainty of what the ground was. Then she went back to the stove and made supper, because the alternative was not useful. The ruling came on a Thursday. Breckenridge rode out himself to deliver it, which told her something before he'd opened his mouth. Lawyers who delivered rulings in person were delivering rulings they thought deserved a human presence. He came in and sat at the kitchen table and put the paper down and said, "The modification holds." Martha sat down. "Ames upheld Harold's authority to modify the payment schedule," Breckenridge said. He found Galston's argument technically interesting, but not dispositive to his word. "The modification stands. The foreclosure clock does not restart. You have the agreed payment schedule, which gives you until the end of March to satisfy the remaining balance." "The end of March," Martha repeated. "Yes." He paused. "Mercer will appeal. I want to be honest with you about that. This isn't final. He'll take it to the circuit court, and that process will take months, possibly longer. But he'll be doing it from a position of having lost the first round, and that matters. Courts look at patterns." He folded his hands on the table. "The land office review is also ongoing. I had a communication from the territorial office yesterday. They've opened a formal inquiry into Mercer's acquisition of the Hobbs property from 3 years ago. Clara Hobbs's testimony, combined with what Vernon Cross provided and 2 additional depositions, was apparently enough to move it from preliminary to formal." He looked at Martha steadily. "I don't want to overstate what this means. It doesn't get your money back or make Mercer disappear, but it means he's defending himself in multiple directions simultaneously, and that is very different from him coming at you from a position of unchallenged strength." Elias, who had been standing near the door through all of this, said quietly, "How long to the end of March?" "About 10 weeks, Breckenridge said. 10 weeks to raise the remaining balance," Elias said. He wasn't asking. "What's the number?" Martha asked. Breckenridge told them. It was not a small number. It was smaller than it had been in November, and the loan from the neighbors had brought it further down, but what remained was still enough to make Martha's chest feel compressed when she looked at it written on paper. Breckenridge left. Martha sat at the table and looked at the ruling and looked at the number. Elias sat across from her. They were both quiet for a while.
The ermine, Elias said at last. Elias. Martha, listen. The ermine and the mountain lion. I haven't sold them. I was holding them because I didn't want to hold nothing. He said it plainly, in the way he said hard things. But if the balance isn't met by March, the ruling doesn't matter. Mercer's lawyer is good enough to run the clock out on the appeal and have another filing ready the moment the payment schedule lapses. He looked at the paper. The ermine could get us 120, maybe 150. The mountain lion. I'd need to get to Denver for what that pelt is worth. There's a furrier there who deals in premium stock. I wrote him last month. He offered 400. Martha stared at him. You wrote a furrier in Denver last month?
I wanted to know what was possible, he said simply. That's the last of it, she said. That's everything you have left from 4 years. It's pelts, he said. They're worth money. I have the skills to make more pelts. He met her eyes. What I don't have is the ability to rebuild a home for my children out of nothing, which is what happens if this property goes to Mercer. She heard what was underneath that. Not just her home. A home. The one he'd been building toward in his mind slowly, over weeks of mornings on her porch, and evenings at her kitchen table, and days spent making her land stronger. She understood that he was not doing this purely for her, or purely for his children, or purely from some abstract principle about what was right. He was doing it for something that was taking shape between all of those things, something neither of them had named because naming it felt like getting ahead of a situation that was still unresolved. She was not ready to name it either, but she understood it. Not yet, she said. Don't sell them yet. We have 10 weeks. Let me try everything else first. What everything else? The cattle production through March. If the weather holds and the prices don't drop, it's not nothing. I can take in laundry from town. I've done it before. There's a family in the valley looking for someone to help with canning through winter. I can do that on the side. She heard herself talking fast, the way you talk when you're trying to outrun an argument you know is reasonable. Give me 6 weeks. If we're still short by 6 weeks out, we talk about Denver. He looked at her for a long moment. 6 weeks, he said. 6 weeks. He nodded. All right. She held his gaze for a second longer than necessary, and then looked back at the ruling on the table. One thing at a time. What she hadn't planned for. What no one planned for, because it arrived from a direction no one was watching, was Cal. The letter came 3 weeks into January, in the handwriting Martha had come to recognize as belonging to Elias's sister, Ruth, the elder Ruth, the one who had been keeping the children, written on paper that had clearly been folded and refolded several times before it found its way into an envelope. Martha handed it to Elias without reading it, of course, and watched his face while he read it. He read it twice. Then he set it on the table face down and looked at the wall for a moment. What happened? She asked. Cal, he said. He's 12 now. 12 and apparently decided he's been patient long enough. He pressed his lips together. He got into a fight at the school in Ruth's town. Bad enough that the teacher sent a note home. Ruth says he's been difficult since October, getting worse. He stopped. She says she doesn't know if she can keep them through March. Martha was very still. She says she can't, she corrected gently, because she'd learned to read around the edges of what people said when they were trying to be careful. He didn't argue it. She says she doesn't know if she can, he repeated, because he needed to say it the way his sister had said it. Elias. I know. He looked at his hands. I know what it means. You need to go now, she said. Not in the spring. Now. Martha, the balance is a problem that will still be here when you get back, she said. Cal is 12 years old and he hasn't seen his father in 2 years, and he's fighting at school, and your sister is telling you she's struggling. That's not a problem that waits. His jaw tightened. If I leave now, who handles? Pete Sutherland said his hired man was looking for extra work through the winter. I'll ask Delbert. He's capable. She leaned forward slightly. I'm capable. You've spent 3 months making this place more capable than it's been in years. I can manage it. It's not about whether you can manage it, he said,
and something in his voice had shifted, tighter, closer to the surface. "I know it's not," she said. He looked at her then, and she held the look, and it was the kind of moment that doesn't announce itself, but that both people understand they'll remember. "I'm coming back," he said. It wasn't a question, but it had the weight of something that needed to be said out loud. "I know you are," she said. "Cal and Ruth, my Ruth, they'll be here. Both of them." He said it like he was laying it down, making it real by saying it. "I want that understood." It's understood.
"And whatever the balance is when I get back, we'll figure it out when you get back," she said. "Together, like we said." He was quiet for a long moment. Rosie was laughing somewhere outside, some game with a snow pile and a piece of rope, the rules of which changed every day. Luke's voice, lower and more measured, responding to something. "I'll leave Thursday," Elias said. "It's 2 days hard travel to my sister's. I can be back within a week and a half if the weather holds." "A week and a half," Martha said. "I'll manage a week and a half." He almost said something else. She could see it, something at the edge of his face, something that wanted to come out and didn't quite make it. He picked up the letter and folded it back along its existing lines and put it in his coat pocket. "I'll go talk to Delbert tomorrow," he said. She nodded. He got up and went back outside, and she listened to the sound of his boots on the frozen porch and then the yard, steady and deliberate, the way he moved through everything. He left Thursday before dawn, the same way he'd arrived, in the dark, with the mules loaded and the axe strapped across his back. Rosie had cried the night before, not dramatically, just the quiet kind of crying that happens when you don't fully understand why something is happening, but you understand that it changes something. Luke had shaken his hand, seriously, adult to adult, and Elias had shaken it back the same way. Martha walked him to the road. It was still dark and very cold, the stars hard and specific overhead, the kind of sky that only appeared when the air was completely clear and the temperature had driven every molecule of haze out of it. "The south gate latch is the good one now," he said. "Don't let Luke use the old one on the east side for anything heavy." "I know," she said. "The grain in the bin should last until—" "Elias." She stopped walking. He stopped too, and turned to look at her. "I know the ranch," she said. "I know it." He looked at her for a second. "Yeah," he said. "You do." She handed him something, a package wrapped in cloth. He took it and looked at her. "Open it on the road," she said. "It's cold." He tucked it into his coat. He didn't say anything for a moment. The mules shifted and breathed their visible breath into the dark. "I'll be back," he said. "I know," she said. He turned and walked up the road, and she watched until the dark had him, and there was only the sound of the mule's hooves on the frozen ground, and then that faded too, and she was standing at the edge of her road in the cold and the dark and the silence. She stood there for a while, long enough to feel what she hadn't let herself feel fully yet, the weight of his absence, which was real and immediate and significant in a way she hadn't entirely anticipated. She didn't stand there so long that she indulged it. Then she turned and walked back to the house, where Luke and Rosie were sleeping, and the fire needed banking, and Delbert was coming at 8 to go over the morning chores, and the cattle needed water, and the day was starting whether she was ready for it or not. She was ready for it. The week and a half became 12 days, because the weather between here and his sister's turned unpredictable on the return trip, and he spent 2 extra days in a way station waiting for a pass to clear. He sent a telegram when he could, and it arrived garbled but legible enough. Delayed, coming soon, all well. And Martha read it in the post office and folded it into her pocket and went back to work. He arrived on a Wednesday afternoon, late, with both mules and 2 children she had never met, and a weariness across his face that was the specific kind that comes not from hard travel, but from the particular emotional labor of reuniting with people you love, after too long apart, and finding them both exactly as you remembered and subtly, irreversibly different. She saw him coming from the kitchen window and went out. Cal was taller than she'd expected, almost as tall as Elias, with his father's set to his jaw and something restless and coiled in the way he stood, like a person who had been sitting still too long and wasn't sure yet that the sitting was over. He looked at the ranch with the evaluating look of a boy who needed to decide quickly whether a place was worth trusting, and she could see him doing it, cataloging the fences and the barn and the house and her. Ruth, the younger Ruth, 9 years old and quiet in the way Elias had described, watchful, stood beside her brother and looked at everything carefully without appearing to look at anything in particular. She had her father's eyes in a different arrangement, softer and more patient. Elias climbed down from the wagon, and the children came to stand beside him, and he put a hand briefly on each of their shoulders, Cal's first, then Ruth's, and said, "This is Martha Calloway. This is where we're staying." Cal looked at Martha, directly, without flinching, the way his father did. "Is it true you let him fix your whole ranch for nothing?" Cal said. "Cal," Elias said. "It's a fair question," Martha said. She looked at Cal steadily. "It's true that your father fixed quite a lot and wouldn't take money for it. It's also true that he asked for something in return that I agreed to." She paused. "Are you hungry?" Cal blinked, recalibrated slightly. "Yeah," he said. "Come inside then." She turned and walked back to the house, and she heard behind her the sounds of the children following, and Rosie bursting out of the barn where she'd been watching from a crack in the door, unable to contain herself, launching herself at Ruth with an enthusiasm that made Ruth take a startled step back and then, slowly, smile. And Luke appearing from behind the barn with the careful pace of a boy who wanted to see everything without looking like he was watching. Elias came in last. He stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the room. The table set for 6, the stew on the stove, the bread she'd baked that morning, Rosie already pulling Ruth toward the corner where her best rocks were kept for important visitors. And something settled across his face. He reached into his coat and held out the cloth package she'd given him. "You didn't open it," she said. "Not on the road," he said. "Didn't feel right." She took it back, unwrapped it. It was a photograph. Not a grand portrait, just the small kind, taken last autumn by a traveling photographer who had come through town and whom Martha had paid 50 cents to photograph her and the children. She'd put it in a cloth because she hadn't known how to give it to him directly without saying more than she was ready to say. He looked at it for a long moment. Her and Luke and Rosie, standing in the yard on a bright autumn day, squinting a little against the light. He folded the cloth back around it carefully and put it back in his coat pocket, close to where the letter from his sister had been. "Thank you," he said. That was all. She turned back to the stove and picked up the spoon and stirred the stew, and behind her she could hear 4 children sorting themselves out in the particular noisy, uncertain, tentative way of children who don't yet know each other but are deciding whether they might want to. It was not perfect. It was not tidy. Cal was difficult that first evening, sharp-tongued and watchful, testing edges, trying to understand what kind of place this was, and whether it was safe enough to stop being guarded in. Ruth knocked over a cup of milk and turned white with the anxiety of a child who had learned that mistakes had costs, and Martha simply got a cloth and cleaned it up and said it happened to everyone and moved on, which Ruth watched with an expression that Martha recognized, the look of someone waiting for the other shoe to drop and slowly beginning to believe there might not be one. Elias washed dishes after supper without being asked, standing at the basin with his sleeves rolled up, and Luke came and stood beside him and dried them. And they didn't talk much, but there was something in the side-by-side of it that was its own kind of conversation. Martha sat at the table after the children had gone to bed and looked at the room. The balance was still there. March was still coming. Mercer's appeal was still working its way through the system, slow and deliberate, and he was still out there with his patience and his resources and his water problem and his certainty that eventually he would win. None of that had gone away. But the table had 6 plates on it now, and the stove was warm, and the ranch that everyone had counted out was standing solid in the winter dark, with its fences repaired and its windmill turning, and its barn roof holding against whatever the sky had left to throw at it. She looked at it all and understood something she hadn't quite been able to see before, that the ranch had always been the point for her, the thing she was fighting to keep. But somewhere in the past 3 months it had become the point for more than just her, and that changed what it was. Not just a piece of land, not just a debt and a deadline and a man with foreclosure papers. Something that had gathered people around it, something that people had chosen, something worth choosing. Elias came and sat across from her, and she looked at him, and he looked back. "The mountain lion pelt," she said. He nodded slowly. "You should go to Denver," she said. "Get what it's worth. We've got 6 weeks to march." She paused. "It might be enough." "It might," he said. "It might not," she said. But we try. He looked at her across the table in the warm kitchen with the sound of the winter pressing against the walls outside, and he said, "We try." Elias left for Denver on a Friday morning with the mountain lion pelt wrapped in oilcloth and strapped across the back of the steadier mule, and the ermine packed flat in the saddlebag. And Martha stood at the road and watched him go the same way she'd watched him go the first time, until the dark or the distance took him, whichever came first. This time it was the distance. The morning was clear and cold and bright, the kind of January morning that looked almost gentle from inside but hit you like a wall the moment you stepped out, and she watched him until the road bent south around the tree line and he was gone. Cal was standing behind her. She hadn't heard him come out. "How far is Denver?" he asked. 4 days? Maybe 5 in this weather." Cal looked at the empty road. He had his father's way of looking at things, that particular focused steadiness, taking inventory without editorializing. "He'll come back," Cal said. Not reassuringly. Just as a statement of fact, the way his father stated facts. "I know he will," Martha said. Cal looked at her sideways. "You're not worried?" "I'm always worried," she said. "That doesn't mean I'm wrong about the fact." He was quiet for a second, then he turned and went back inside, and Martha stood at the road a moment longer before she followed. The next 10 days had a particular quality to them that Martha would think about later. Not as a suspended time, not as waiting exactly, but as something more active than that. The ranch ran. Delbert came 3 mornings a week and handled the heavier work, and Luke had taken on the fence checks as his own responsibility with a seriousness that would have worried her if she hadn't understood that Luke needed something to be responsible for. For Cal worked alongside Luke after the first 2 awkward days, not warmly at first, not with easy camaraderie, but with the practical side-by-side cooperation of 2 boys who had decided, without discussing it, that the work was more interesting than the alternative. Ruth followed Martha. Not clingingly. The child wasn't clingy. But wherever Martha was in the course of a morning, Ruth was somewhere nearby, watching the way she watched everything, filing things. Martha taught her to test milk for freshness. She taught her how to read the sky for incoming weather, the specific cloud formations that meant serious snow versus the ones that meant cold but clear. She taught her the difference between the sounds the windmill made when it was working correctly and the sounds it made when something needed attention, because Elias had taught Martha that, and it seemed like the kind of knowledge that should keep moving forward. Ruth absorbed all of it with a quiet intensity and almost never asked questions during the lesson, but would come back hours later with one precise, well-considered question that showed she'd been turning the thing over in her mind all day. She reminded Martha of Luke in this, and she reminded her of Elias, and she reminded her of a version of herself at 9 years old, before the world had required her to be primarily practical, back when she'd had the luxury of thinking carefully about things before she said them. One evening, 4 days into Elias's absence, Ruth appeared in the kitchen doorway while Martha was working on the accounts at the table. "Do you like my father?" Ruth asked. Martha looked up. Ruth was leaning against the doorframe in her nightgown, with her arms folded across her chest, the way a person stands when they've been rehearsing something. "Yes," Martha said. "Do you like him the way you liked Martha's father?" Ruth said. Then catching herself, "I mean, Mr. Calloway, your husband." Martha set down her pen. "Your father is not like Thomas," she said carefully. "They're different people. What I feel about your father is its own thing, not a replacement for something, just what it is." Ruth processed this. "Cal says you're going to get married." "Cal says a lot of things. He's usually right." "He's 12, Martha said. Ruth almost smiled. It was brief and slightly reluctant, the smile of a child who finds something funny and isn't ready to fully admit it. "He'd say that doesn't mean he's wrong." "He'd probably be right about that too," Martha said. Ruth looked at her for another second with those patient eyes. "I wouldn't mind," she said. Exactly the words Luke had used months ago in the barn. Martha felt something move through her chest, the specific ache of something that has been hoped for quietly for long enough that the hope has become tender. "Go to bed, Ruth," she said gently. Ruth went. Martha sat at the table for a while longer, not working on the accounts, just sitting with the kitchen sounds around her and the cold pressing at the windows, and the fact of 4 children asleep in the rooms above her, 2 of whom had her blood and 2 of whom did not, all of whom were hers in some way she hadn't finished understanding yet. The telegram from Denver arrived on a Wednesday, 9 days after Elias had left. Martha was in town for supplies, cash only. She hadn't forgotten that. When the telegraph operator flagged her down on the street with the paper in his hand, she read it standing on the sidewalk in the cold. Furrier paid $4.60 for Lion. Ermine went $1.40. Leaving tomorrow. Home. Friday. E. Boone. $600. Combined with what the cattle had produced through January, combined with the neighbor loan, combined with what remained of the $43 she'd started all of this with, and the money she'd made from the laundry and the canning work, she did the math right there on the sidewalk, in her head, without paper. She stood very still for a moment. It was enough. Not lavishly enough, not with anything left over to speak of, but enough. The balance on the note, satisfied with perhaps $30 to spare. She folded the telegram and put it in her coat pocket and stood on the sidewalk in the thin winter sun and let herself feel it for exactly 1 minute. Not the relieved kind of feeling, the real kind, the kind that comes when something you've been holding at the edges of your strength for months finally shifts and you realize how much of yourself you've been spending just to keep holding it. Then she went to Harold Finch's bank. Harold was at his desk and looked up when she came in with the expression of a man who had been carrying a version of her situation in his own conscience for weeks. She set the accounting paper on his desk. "Tell me what I owe exactly today." Harold opened the ledger, ran the numbers, wrote the figure on a piece of paper and pushed it across. She looked at it, looked at her own math, looked back at Harold. "I can pay that," she said. Harold looked at her. "I can pay that in full," she said. Friday. When Elias gets back from Denver, Harold looked down at the figure, then up at her. Something moved across his face, not quite relief, but adjacent to it. The expression of a man who had been complicit in something uncomfortable and was being offered a way out of the discomfort. "Friday," he said. "Friday," she confirmed. "Mercer's appeal is a matter for the circuit court," she said. "If the note is paid in full, what does the appeal argue?" Harold was quiet for a moment. "Nothing," he said. "If the underlying debt is satisfied, the foreclosure basis is gone. The appeal argues nothing." He paused. "You might find another angle. You understand that?" "I understand that," Martha said. "But the ranch stays mine." Harold nodded. Slowly, with the weight of a man who knows he made some wrong choices and is watching the consequences of someone else's right ones. "The ranch stays yours," he said. She shook his hand and walked out into the cold and stood on the street and thought, Friday, 2 days, Elias coming home with the money, and then it was over. This specific version of the fight, this particular battle that had been running since November, was over. Mercer would find another angle. Harold was right about that, and she wasn't naive enough to pretend otherwise. Men like Gideon Mercer didn't pivot to something else after one loss. They accumulated losses until they decided a target wasn't worth the cost, and they hadn't reached that calculation yet. But the ranch would be hers, legally, fully, with nothing hanging over it, and that changed everything about what came next. She didn't tell the children about the telegram right away. She wasn't sure why, except that it felt premature to celebrate something that wasn't finished yet. And she'd learned in the past months that the space between a thing being likely and a thing being done was exactly the space where things went wrong. But Rosie, who had an almost supernatural sensitivity to shifts in her mother's mood, appeared at her elbow that evening while Martha was making supper and said, without any preamble, "Something good happened." "Why do you think that?" "Because you're stirring that pot too fast," Rosie said. "You stir fast when you're happy. You stir slow when you're worried." Martha looked at the spoon in her hand, consciously slowed it. "Your father's coming home Friday," she told Rosie, "with enough." Rosie looked up at her. "Enough for what?" "Enough for everything." Rosie made a sound that was not quite a word, a compressed, high-pitched sound of pure feeling, and threw her arms around Martha's waist from behind, and Martha stood at the stove and held the girl's arms with one hand and kept the other on the spoon, and felt the tears come up fast and press behind her eyes, and blinked them back and kept stirring. "Don't tell the others yet," she said. "Let's wait for Elias." Rosie held on for another second, then let go and stepped back to her place at the table with the satisfied expression of a child who has been trusted with something and intends to hold it carefully. Elias came back late Friday afternoon, later than expected, because one of the mules had thrown a shoe outside of Darrow Creek, and he'd had to walk the last 4 miles leading both animals on a road that had gone to ice. He came in the back way, through the barn, and Martha heard the mule's familiar sound before she heard anything else, and she went out. He was in worse shape than when he'd left. His coat was soaked through on the left side from a fall on the ice that he'd mentioned only by way of explaining why he was moving stiffly, and his face had the particular tight blankness of a person operating on the far end of their reserves. She took the mules. He didn't argue, which told her how tired he was. "Denver?" she said while she worked the tack. "Done," he said. He reached into his coat and produced a folded envelope, thicker than the one he'd brought back from Carver's Crossing. Furrier was fair, argued a little, but not much. He leaned against the stall divider. "How's the balance?" "I know the exact number," she said. "I went to Harold on Wednesday." He looked at her. "It's enough," she said. "What you brought back from Denver, plus everything we have, well, it's enough. Just enough, but enough." He was quiet for a long moment. She finished with the mules and turned around, and he was looking at the barn wall with an expression she'd come to recognize, that inward look, the one that meant something was being processed that was too large and too private to put directly into words. "Elias," she said. He looked at her. "Come inside," she said. "Your children are asking about you. Cal's been going out to the road every hour since 3 o'clock. Something broke slightly in his face at that. Not dramatically, just the quiet fracture of a contained thing releasing a little pressure. "He has," he said. "Every hour," she confirmed. "He'd be furious if you told him I told you." That almost smile. There it was. "Then we won't tell him," Elias said, and pushed off the stall divider and followed her out of the barn and across the yard toward the house, where the light was warm in the windows, and the sound of 4 children doing something complicated and probably argument-adjacent was already audible from outside. They went to Harold Finch's bank the following Monday morning, all of it. Martha had not been able to get everyone to come. It wasn't a practical thing, a crowd at the bank. But Pete and Agnes Sutherland were there, because Pete had insisted and Martha hadn't fought him on it. Clara Hobbs came. Breckenridge rode over from his office because he said he'd seen too many of these things go sideways at the last moment and wanted to be there when it didn't. Harold Finch received them with a formality that Martha suspected was partly professional and partly the careful self-possession of a man who was aware he was going to have to tell Gideon Mercer something that Mercer would not want to hear and was bracing for it. Elias set the envelope on the counter. Harold counted it. All of it. The Denver money, the cattle money, the neighbor contributions, the laundry work, the canning, the $43 from the floorboard box that now seemed almost ceremonially small but was still part of it. He counted it twice, which was his professional habit, and which everyone in the room endured with the patience of people who understood why precision mattered. Then he wrote the receipt. Paid in full. He dated it, signed it, pressed his stamp to it, and slid it across the counter. Martha picked it up, read the words, held it. She did not cry in Harold Finch's bank. She'd decided that in advance, and she held to it, though it required something from her. She shook Harold's hand. He held hers a beat longer than a professional handshake required. "Mercer will hear about this today," Harold said quietly. "Let him," she said. She walked out of the bank into the February morning, and Pete Sutherland shook Elias's hand hard enough to make Elias wince slightly and hide it. And Agnes hugged Martha, and Clara Hobbs did not hug anyone because Clara Hobbs expressed satisfaction through the set of her chin and the quality of her silence. And Breckenridge made a note in his file and said he'd send word to the circuit court that the underlying debt was satisfied and recommend the appeal be dismissed. It would still take time. Breckenridge was honest about that. Paperwork moved at paperwork speed and the circuit court didn't rush for anyone. But dismissed it would be because there was nothing left to appeal. The 4 of them stood on the sidewalk outside the bank in the cold, bright morning. "Well," Pete said after a moment. "Well," Martha agreed. That was all any of them seemed to need to say about it. Mercer came 3 days later. He didn't bring the banker this time, or the armed riders, or the city lawyer. He came alone, in his wagon, in the mid-morning, and he tied his horse at the fence and walked to the front door and knocked. That was the thing Martha noted immediately. He knocked. She opened the door. He looked older than she'd expected, or maybe she was seeing him differently, now that the thing between them had resolved into something he couldn't reopen. He was still dressed well, still carrying himself with the particular confidence of a man who had a lot and knew it. But something in his face had shifted, some quality of certainty, of inevitability, that had been there every other time he'd stood in her yard. "Mrs. Calloway," he said. "Mr. Mercer," she said. He looked past her into the kitchen, briefly, and she didn't step aside to invite him in. "I heard you satisfied the note," he said. "Harold tells people things," she said. Not unkindly, just noting it. "It's a small valley." He looked at her directly. "I came to say that the appeal will be withdrawn." She hadn't expected that. She kept her face still. "My lawyer tells me that the circuit court will dismiss it regardless," he said. "I'd rather withdraw it than be dismissed." He paused. "I don't enjoy losing things, but I have enough sense to know when something is over." "All right," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Something behind his eyes worked through something. "The creek," he said at last. "Your southern creek. My western pasture has a water problem, as you may know." "I know," she said. He looked at her steadily. "I'd be willing to discuss an easement arrangement, properly structured, properly compensated. Not a seizure, a business agreement." He said it carefully, like a man who has rehearsed saying something and is aware of how it sounds. "I should have offered that 2 years ago instead of going at it the way I went at it." Martha held his gaze for a long moment. This was not an apology. She understood that and didn't expect it to be. Gideon Mercer was not a man built for apologies. This was a calculation, a recognition that he'd spent considerable resources and gained nothing, that the legal and public pressure had cost him more than he'd anticipated, that there was a way to get what he actually needed without the war he'd been fighting. It was practical, and it was self-interested, and it was, nonetheless, the first honest thing she'd ever heard him say. "I'll consider it," she said. His jaw tightened slightly. She thought he'd expected either yes or no. "That's all?" "That's all," she said. "I'll consider it. If I decide there's an arrangement that works for my ranch and for my family, I'll have Breckenridge contact your lawyer." He looked at her for a second longer. Then he nodded, a single, small nod, and turned and walked back to his wagon. She watched him go. Not triumphantly. She wasn't built for triumph, not the loud kind. Just watching, the way you watch something that has been large in your life move away from you and become smaller in proportion to the distance. She closed the door. Elias was standing at the kitchen table, having heard all of it. "Well," he said. "Well," she said. "You going to talk to him about the easement?" She thought about it honestly. "Maybe," she said, "if the terms are fair. The creek water doesn't cost me anything to let run through an easement, and if he pays properly for it." She stopped. "Does that bother you?" He considered this with the seriousness he brought to everything. "No," he said. "Business is business. People can do bad things and still have legitimate needs." He paused. "Just make sure Breckenridge writes it airtight." "Breckenridge writes everything airtight," she said. "Good." He picked up his coffee. "Then maybe." She sat down across from him, and they were quiet for a minute, and it was the good kind of quiet. Not the absence of things to say, but the presence of so much that had already been said over so many mornings at this table that silence between them had become a comfortable place to be. March came in, and the snow started pulling back from the south-facing slopes, and the creek ran higher and faster with the melt, and the cattle moved with more energy in the warmer air, and the ranch that had been dying in November was, by every honest measure, not dying anymore. The chicken coop Elias had built held 12 birds now, including 4 that Rosie had named against everyone's better judgment and which were consequently impossible to eat. The loft ladder that he'd replaced in December held without complaint under the weight of hay bales. The drainage channel along the barn's north side kept the mud from accumulating the way it had every previous March. And this seemed like a small thing, but it was the kind of small thing that, multiplied across a whole season of small things working correctly, added up to a ranch that ran instead of lurching. Cal had settled. Not entirely. Cal might never entirely settle, and Martha had come to think that was probably fine, that a boy with that much energy pressing against the inside of him would figure out eventually how to point it toward something useful, the same way his father had. But he'd stopped fighting. He'd started working alongside Luke with what amounted to professional respect. the kind that develops between two people when they've discovered they're good at different things, and those different things turn out to be complementary. Luke's patience and Cal's speed, Luke's eye for structural problems, and Cal's instinct for the faster fix that would hold long enough for the permanent solution. They were an unlikely team, and they functioned. Ruth had learned by the middle of March to read the sky better than Martha had initially expected. She would come in some mornings and announce the weather with the matter-of-fact authority of someone reporting established facts. And she was correct often enough that both boys had started paying attention to what she said, which Ruth accepted as her due without making any visible show of satisfaction. These were not perfect children. Cal talked too much and pushed too hard, and had a temper that he was still learning to manage, and sometimes he said things that landed wrong and didn't know it, and sometimes he knew it and said them anyway. Ruth held herself apart in ways that occasionally looked like coldness, but were actually the particular self-protection of a child who had been bounced between insufficient and adequate care for too long and wasn't fully convinced that adequacy was permanent. Luke still carried his grief in the set of his shoulders, still went quiet in the particular way he went quiet when something reminded him of Thomas, still hadn't fully learned to ask for help instead of simply not needing it to dangerous degrees. Rosie still named animals that shouldn't be named and made rules for games that didn't make sense, and demanded with the absolute certainty of a 7-year-old that the universe accommodate her sense of how things should work. They were a household of imperfect people doing their imperfect best in a situation that had been thrown together by necessity and had, somehow, by the slow accumulation of days and shared meals and work and argument and the kind of trust that only builds through actually being tested, become something real. The evening that Martha would later think of as the one that settled it wasn't dramatic. There was no moment of declaration, no scene that announced itself as significant. It was a Tuesday in late March, mild enough that the kitchen door was open an inch for the first time since November, and the sound of the creak came faintly through the gap, along with air that smelled like mud and last year's grass and the beginning of something new. Elias was at the table writing to his sister, the elder Ruth, who had been sending letters with a frequency that suggested she was cautiously optimistic about how things had turned out and wanted to stay connected to the proof of it. The children were in various states of the evening, Cal and Luke outside doing something that involved the fence line and some dispute about technique that Martha could hear but couldn't quite make out. Rosie and the younger Ruth at the other end of the table working on something with string and sticks that Ruth was directing and Rosie was complicating. Martha was doing the March accounts. The numbers were better than February. Not comfortable. Comfortable was still a ways off, and she wasn't the kind of person who confused better with finished. But better was real, and she was willing to say so to herself. She looked at the numbers for a while, and then she looked across the table at Elias, who was writing in his careful, slightly cramped handwriting that got worse at the end of a long day when his hands were tired. "What are you telling her?" Martha asked. He looked up. "That things are good," he said. "That we're all right." She looked at him across the table, the letter in his hand, the kitchen around them, the sound of the creak. "Are we?" she asked, not doubting, genuinely asking, the way you ask someone whose opinion you trust when you want their honest read on a situation you're maybe too close to see clearly. He put the letter down and looked at her with the directness that was one of the first things she'd understood about him, that particular quality of looking at a thing and saying what it was. "Yeah," he said, "we are." "The easement negotiation is going to be a headache," she said. "Breckenridge will handle it. The circuit court dismissal still isn't official." "It will be. The summer is going to be a lot of work." "It always is." She looked at him. He looked back. "Elias," she said. "Martha," he said. She said, "Stay. Not for the ranch. Not for the children. Not as a practical arrangement. Not as an extension of the deal they'd made in November on a freezing porch with a bucket of milk in her hands and nowhere left to turn. Just stay." Because he was the kind of person who noticed a loft ladder was broken without being asked and fixed it without making a production of it. Because he talked to Luke like Luke was worth the conversation. Because he'd handed 4 years of work to a banker without theatrics or resentment and then gone back to work the next morning. Because she'd sat on her porch steps in the dark with him and felt, for the first time in 2 years, like she was not entirely alone in a problem, and then not alone in the rest of it either. Because she trusted him. Not blindly, not perfectly, but in the way that mattered, the way that had been tested against real conditions and held. He was quiet for a moment. The string game at the other end of the table had gotten complicated, and Rosie was explaining something at length to Ruth, who was listening with patient skepticism.
"I'm not easy," he said. "I know. Cal is going to be a project for a while yet."
"Luke will be fine with Cal. I work early. I'm out before dawn most mornings." "I noticed in November," she said. He looked at the letter in his hand, at the table between them, at her. "I'm not Thomas," he said quietly, not as a warning, just as a truth that needed acknowledging. "No," she said, "you're not. And I'm not whoever you thought you were building a life toward back when you had different plans. We're just who we are." She held his gaze. "I think that's enough." He thought about it for a long moment, a real moment, not a performative hesitation, actually thinking, the way he thought about fence posts and drainage channels, and the weight load of a barn roof in winter, taking it seriously because it was serious. Then he said, "I'm going to finish this letter." She looked at him. "And then I'll tell you yes," he said. She looked at him for another second. He picked up his pen and went back to writing, and the corner of his mouth did the thing it did. That quick, involuntary, almost smile that she'd first noticed in November and had come to understand was about as expressive as Elias Boone was likely to get when he was happy about something. She turned back to her accounts. Rosie looked up from the string game and studied the two adults at the table with the frank evaluating stare of a 7-year-old who has been paying attention to something for a long time and has just registered a confirmation of a theory. She looked at Ruth. Ruth looked back. Rosie made a small, satisfied nod. Ruth's expression said she had arrived at the same conclusion 3 weeks ago. They went back to the string game. He finished the letter. He told her yes. It was not a grand declaration. It happened at the table, in the middle of a Tuesday evening, with the creak audible through the open door, and 4 children in various states of noise and a stack of account papers, and an unfinished letter to a woman in the North who had held things together long enough for the right things to happen. He said yes, and she said good, and that was the whole of it, except that later, after the children were in bed and the kitchen was quiet and the fire was low, he reached across the table and put his hand over hers, briefly, and she turned her hand over and held it for a moment before she let go and got up to bank the stove for the night. Small, ordinary. The kind of thing that doesn't show up in the way people later tell a story because it doesn't look from the outside like the thing it is. But it was. Spring came the way. Spring always came on the frontier. Not all at once, not gently, but in argument with the remnants of winter. Warm days followed by cold snaps, green starting in the low spots, while the higher ground was still crusted. The creek ran high and fast and clean, and the cattle grew restless with the energy of animals that have been confined through a hard season and are ready to move. Martha planted the kitchen garden in the 3rd week of April, and Ruth helped her, kneeling in the fresh-turned soil with a purposefulness that suggested she'd decided this was her work now and intended to do it correctly. Rosie helped in the way Rosie helped everything, with enormous enthusiasm and inconsistent follow-through. And by the end of the morning, 3 of the seed rows were perfectly straight, and 2 were creative interpretations of the concept. Cal and Luke rebuilt the east pasture gate from the ground up, Cal's idea, Luke's planning, both of them executing it over the course of a week with an investment in the outcome that showed in the care of the finish work. When they were done, Cal stood back and looked at it with the expression of a boy trying very hard not to look proud of himself. And Luke said it was good, and Cal said it would do, and that was the full length of the celebration. Elias watched the gate go up from a distance, doing his own work nearby, and said nothing to either boy about it until the very end, when he walked over and tested the latch and the swing and the weight of it, methodically, the way he tested everything. "That'll hold," he said. Cal looked away, affecting indifference. Luke looked at the gate. "Yeah," Luke said, "it will." The valley talked about the Callaway Ranch for a while that spring. The story had spread, the way stories spread in small places where there isn't much news and people are hungry for a version of events that contains something worth repeating. The story got bigger in the telling, the way all stories do, and some of what got repeated wasn't quite accurate, and some of it was more accurate than Martha was comfortable with. What was true, in the version that lasted, a woman had been close to losing everything, and a stranger had shown up and decided it wasn't going to happen, and the valley had rallied around them both in a way that surprised everyone involved, including the valley itself. What didn't get told as often, because it was harder to make into a story. The part where none of it had been clean or certain or easy. The part where Elias had spent nights working through calculations behind his eyes and hadn't been sure the math would come out right. The part where Martha had sat at her kitchen table alone doing a kind of arithmetic that didn't have a good answer and had done it anyway because the alternative was stopping, and stopping was the only choice she'd already made against. The part where two people who had both been broken by the things that had happened to them had sat across a table night after night and slowly, imperfectly, without any guarantee, decided to be something that could hold. Clara Hobbs came out in May, ostensibly to see how the garden was coming along, and drank coffee at the kitchen table and looked around the house. At the children's drawings Rosie had put on the wall, at the new curtains Ruth had made from cloth Martha had been saving, at Elias's coat hanging on the peg by the door alongside Martha's and the four children's, and said nothing for a long moment. Then she said, "Thomas would have liked him." Martha looked at her. "I know you didn't ask my opinion," Clara said. "I'm giving it anyway because I'm old and I've earned the right." "You have," Martha agreed. "He would have," Clara said again. "Not right away." Thomas was particular about people. But eventually. She finished her coffee. Eventually he'd have thought Elias Boone was all right. Martha looked at the coat on the peg. "He is," she said. "He's all right." Clara set down her cup and stood up and said she had to get back before the afternoon cold set in, and Martha walked her to the door, and they stood on the porch for a moment in the spring air that still had an edge to it but was losing the edge slowly, day by day. "You going to tell me what you said to Mercer about the easement?" Clara asked. "Breckenridge is working on the terms." "I know Breckenridge is working on the terms. What did you say to Mercer?" Martha almost smiled. "I told him I'd consider it if the terms were fair." "And are they?" "Not yet," Martha said. "But they're getting there." Clara nodded approvingly. "Don't let him lowball you on the access width." "I won't." Clara went down the porch steps and across the yard to her wagon with the brisk efficiency of a woman who has always moved like her time was worth something. She climbed up and took the reins and looked back at Martha on the porch. "Good spring," she said. "Good spring," Martha agreed. Clara drove away, and Martha stood on the porch in the April air and looked out at the ranch. The fences holding, the windmill turning steady, the cattle moving in the south pasture. The garden rows fresh turned and waiting, the barn roof sound and the drainage channel dry from last night's rain that had run off clean instead of pooling. And somewhere around the east side of the barn, she could hear Cal arguing about something, and Luke responding with the patient brevity of a boy who has learned to pick his moments. And from the garden came Ruth's voice, precise and informative, telling Rosie something about seed depth that Rosie was only partially attending to. The ranch that had been dying in November was alive. Not perfect. Still carrying the weight of what it had been through. Still with rough edges and work to do, and a negotiation with Gideon Mercer that would require Breckenridge's steadiest hand and Martha's most careful attention. Still with 4 children who were figuring out what they were to each other, and 2 adults who were doing the same. Still with debts that were satisfied but a future that was unwritten, and 100 things that could still go sideways in 100 different ways. Alive, and hers, and not hers alone anymore. She had thought, in the worst weeks of November, that survival was the goal. Just survival. Get through it. Keep the ranch. Keep the children fed. Keep standing. That had been the whole of her ambition, stripped down to its essential. She understood now that survival was not the ceiling. It was the floor. The thing you had to have before you could have anything else. And she had it. Had built it back from almost nothing, with help she hadn't known to ask for from people she hadn't known would give it. And with a stranger who had showed up at her door with holes in his boots and a proposition that had no reason to be anything other than absurd. What she had now was not just a ranch that hadn't died. It was something she hadn't had the capacity to imagine in November, when imagining took resources she couldn't spare. It was a life that had more people in it than she'd thought she had room for, and more warmth than she'd thought she'd let herself need again, and more possibility than a woman who has spent 2 years counting everything she doesn't have is easily able to see. She heard Elias come around from the other side of the barn, the sound of his boots on the ground, the specific cadence she'd learned to recognize the way you learn to recognize the sounds a house makes. And she turned, and he was crossing the yard toward her with the same unhurried deliberateness he brought to everything, and he looked up and saw her on the porch, and that brief involuntary thing happened at the corner of his mouth. "Clara gone?" he said. "Just left." He came up the porch steps and stood beside her and looked out at the same yard she'd been looking at. "Water trough on the north side needs new boards along the top edge," he said, "before summer." "All right," she said, "and the kitchen garden's going to need a second fence if you want to keep the rabbits out. The existing one's got gaps." Ruth mentioned that this morning. He nodded, looked at the yard, at the cattle in the south pasture, at the gate Cal and Luke had built, standing solid and square in the late April light. "Good spring," he said. She looked at the side of his face, the lines around his eyes from years of outdoor work and insufficient sleep and everything else that had made him the particular person he was. Not a smooth face, not an easy face, a face that had been through things and come out the other side knowing exactly what things cost. "Good spring?" she said. They stood on the porch together for a while, in the easy quiet that had come to be one of the things she valued most about him. The fact that he understood when words were necessary and when they weren't, and that he didn't fill silence just to fill it. The afternoon moved around them, the children's voices from the yard, the windmill turning, the creek running, somewhere past the south pasture, year-round and clean and hers. None of it had been easy. None of it had come without cost. Elias had given up years of work and revised his plans and stayed longer than he'd planned and handed over things that had mattered to him without anyone asking him to. Martha had accepted help she'd been raised to refuse and let people see her struggling and trusted a stranger at a moment when trust was the one thing she could least afford to spend carelessly. The children, all four of them, had bent and adjusted and occasionally broken a little and found ways to hold themselves together that they hadn't needed before. That was the thing about it, the thing that Clara Hobbs had understood, and Pete Sutherland had understood, and Breckenridge in his careful legal way had understood. None of it was the story of a perfect rescue. It was the story of people being willing to be imperfect in the direction of each other, of choosing, in the specific moments when choosing was hard, to do the thing that cost them something rather than the thing that didn't. You could tell that story easily, the outside version. The stranger who fixed the ranch, the widow who held on, the neighbors who showed up, the villain who eventually withdrew. It compressed into something clean and satisfying and simple. But the inside of it was different. The inside of it was Elias at 2 a.m. checking on the animals because he couldn't sleep. It was Martha at the kitchen table with her hands flat on the wood, learning the shape of a fear she couldn't make smaller by looking at it. It was Luke, 11 years old and trying to be enough of everything, learning to push on a fence post at the base and feel what kind of damage was there. It was Cal, fighting at school 1,000 miles away because he didn't know how else to say he needed his father. It was Ruth, the younger one, watching Martha clean up spilled milk without anger and waiting, for weeks, for the other shoe. Those were the real things. The small, inglorious, entirely human things that don't make it into the version people repeat, but they were also the things that built what got built. Not the grand gestures, though the grand gestures mattered, they'd mattered enormously, but the ordinary days, the consistent choices, the accumulated weight of people deciding to show up again tomorrow. That was worth something. That was, Martha thought, standing on her porch in the April afternoon with the man who had come down from the mountains and decided her ranch was worth saving, worth considerably more than the sum of its particular parts. It was worth a life. Several lives. All of them now tangled together in the irreversible way of people who have been through something real and come out the other side changed by it, not finished. People like this were never finished. There would be more hard seasons, more problems that didn't have clean answers, more moments of doubt and cost and difficult math. The frontier didn't run out of those, but they would face them from here, from this porch, with this view, with these people. And that was enough. That was, in the end, everything.